Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable, see playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 2221, Heavy Sea Water. Spark, what else you're worried about? A bearded exile uttered, we have all seen the means the warden race set up. We are far more superior than them. I am sure even 10 Emilys would stand no chance against us. Hearing this, Spark smiled faintly. You're right, but don't forget that the girl and her brother are in the hands of Emily, and they know this place like the back of their hand. The warden race could not be feeling really confident, otherwise why would they lure us here to fight them? You have a point there. The bearded man nodded. The other exiles were also silent. Aside from Spark and the exiles from the Yellow Emperor race who belonged to the first tier, the 20+ exiles were slightly weaker. If they were to engage in direct combat with Emily, there was no doubt that these warriors would lose. In order to leave the world, they had no choice but to let themselves be used by the warden race. The result of the battle was equally important to them. As Zelda led the way, Emily, Timotheus, and their group started picking up speed. There was no attractive scenery in this dark space. The gray color seemed to be designed to make people feel depressed and hopeless. Fortunately, the exiles had strong minds, and all of them looked very calm. However, the elders of various races and the elite wild gods were all on edge. At the very slightest of sounds, they would become very vigilant. Long-term vigilance would cause them to quickly get tired. Only Emily and the others who walked ahead leading the way could make them feel slightly relaxed. After they had walked for 100 miles, they started hearing the faint sound of water. It sounded like ocean waves constantly rolling. Oddly enough, there was no water in sight at all. Hearing this odd noise, Zelda stopped immediately. What's wrong? Emily asked as she stepped forward. It's the heavy sea water, said Zelda with a frown. What is the heavy sea water? Emily asked. Just as Emily asked, a series of slender bubbles suddenly appeared on the ground in the distance, moving towards them at an alarming speed. Be careful, they are manipulating the heavy sea water to attack us. Zelda couldn't keep up a calm facade and stepped back quickly. Splash! The bubbles on the ground rapidly flew into the air, which turned out to be slender water arrows. At first, the water arrows didn't seem like much to worry about, but as they got closer, everyone could see clearly that each of them was about 700,000 feet long and incomparably huge. Inside each of the arrows, the light blue water swirled violently, forming a sharp arrowhead, which contained a power that would scare anyone. Retreat! Emily shouted. The others could retreat, but she could not. Facing those huge water arrows, Emily stretched out her hand and gently patted. A radiant wristband appeared on her arm. She shook the wristband lightly, and a curtain of colorful light, like an unfolded umbrella, manifested in front of her. Puff! The first water arrow hit the light curtain, and the light curtain gently swayed. Then, the water arrow spread out. Puff, puff, puff. Then, more water arrows hit the light curtain, generating a huge impact force. Emily raised her right hand high to steady the light curtain and said lightly, "Everyone, follow me and continue to move on." These water arrows smashed into the colorful light curtain and kept on making loud explosions. Even Zen was shocked when he saw this scene. With his current cultivation base, it was very difficult for him to block a water arrow. However, when Emily was in front of them, she managed to resist all the attacks. This woman was too powerful. Everyone gathered behind Emily and went on. However, these huge arrows kept hitting them relentlessly, with no signs of slowing down. As a result, their marching speed decreased too. The progress of the warriors was extremely slow. After moving slowly for 1 hour, they had only traveled about 4 miles. This space was not large, but at their current speed, it would take them a long time to navigate their way through. We can't keep going on like this, Emily said with a frown. Zelda, where did these arrows come from? Zelda looked into the distance and said with a frown, the heavy sea water is being shot by the heavy water crossbow. I don't know who is controlling it, but they must have hidden somewhere to snipe us. Is that so? Emily lowered her head and thought for a while. Then she looked at Timotheus and said, please do me a favor. Thank you. Timotheus immediately understood what she was referring to. He nodded slightly and said, "Ramsay, Leopold, come with me." The three of them were the strongest among the exiles of the Nine Li race. In this situation, those other races had gone all out to attack them without showing any mercy. Without hesitation, the three of them rushed out of the light curtain and turned into three beams of light. They dexterously shuttled through the huge water arrows and soon disappeared from everyone's sight. The others were still hiding behind Emily. Under the current circumstances, there was not much that they could do to help. They could only wait passively, including Zen. After a while, there were suddenly several beams of bright light rising into the sky in the distance. Boom, 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 the earth started shaking. A hint of worry flashed on the faces of several elders from the Nine Li race. It was obvious that the three exiles of the Nine Li race were fighting with someone, most likely from the Warden race. It was natural for them to be worried about their safety, especially Adele. After all, her father was one of them. The intense roar lasted for a period of time before it quieted down, and the water arrows that were shot from afar also disappeared. Not long after, three beams of light flew over from afar. Everyone was relieved to see the three exiles of the Nine Li race return safely. Timotheus was in the lead, and he carried one man in his hand. Bang! After he arrived at the front of the crowd, he threw the man down casually, tossing him down in front of everyone. As the exiles looked down, confused expressions appeared on their faces. Is that Bert? Isn't he Bert from the Four-Image race? What is he doing here? The Four-Image race was a small race with its bloodline. In this race, there were only two exiles, one of whom was Bert. They all recognized the man lying in front of them immediately. Timotheus stared at the man and said, "Apart from him, those who released the water arrows just now also included one member from the Earth Fiend race, and one member from the Nine Eyes race. The two of them have been killed by me. It seems that these small races have entered this place before us." Emily frowned. So, Spark is also here. In her eyes, the exiles from those small races were not a big threat to her, but the strength of Spark still made Emily scared, especially when he was lurking somewhere to launch attacks. Chapter 2222, The Strength Equalizing Theurgy. Bert, who was now curled up on the ground, let out a sudden, strangled laugh. Emily frowned at him. "What are you laughing at?" she barked. "Spark has come. Of course he's come," he said, his eyes glowing as he stared at her. "So what?" she said, sneeringly. "He is no match for me. But I hadn't expected you exiles to be so stupid as to follow the Yellow Emperor race." The Yellow Emperor race was the second strongest in this world, but was still quite inferior to the Snake Goddess race. There was almost no match for Emily in this world. Timotheus and Spark might be her opponents, but they were still inferior to her. "Or what? You think nothing of us?" Bert roared ferociously at Emily's words. "You big races always oppress us, step by step. You have the chance to escape now, but did you consider us? Did you count us? To be honest, I don't think the Warden race will really let us leave after we kill you. But since we can't leave, neither can you guys." The exiles were taken aback at how fiercely Bert was reacting. Over the past few years, the smaller races and their exiles had been oppressed to no end. Since it was the group of exiles who supported the development of a race, it was obvious that they were immensely strong. Although many of the small races chose to form allies, they still couldn't fight against the large races that were way stronger than them, especially top-rank races like the Snake Goddess race and the Nine Li race. When the small races were oppressed, their exiles could only make their clansmen retreat. They couldn't change the fact that they had to endure what they were going through. And as time passed, the exiles became full of resentment towards the large races. They had lived in the same world in the past. Now that exiles like Bert had heard the news of the Snake Goddess race finding a way to escape from this world, the resentment they had accumulated over the years finally erupted. Just as Bert had predicted, since they were unable to leave, the large races of this world couldn't leave either. They were like a group of people stuck in a well and struggling to climb out. Those at the top were on the verge of escaping, but the people below them were so desperate that they did everything they could to hinder them. "Cut the garbage, kill him and move on," an exile of the fire-melting race exclaimed. He walked up to Bert, his hand burning with a terrifying-looking fire. Emily sighed and turned around. In this world, they fought more fiercely against each other because of the lack of resources, and there wasn't anything they could do about it. Fire! The blazing flames quickly wrapped around Bert. Bert roared vicious curses through the flames. "You will die here. All of you will die here. No one will escape." But just as the flames began to engulf Bert and drown him out, a kind of great energy emerged from his body. He had chosen to blow himself up. The power that the explosion of this powerhouse at the other shore realm radiated was terrifying. Even though Bert was among the weakest of the exiles, the power of his self-explosion was still not to be underestimated. Even the remaining power that spread rapidly out was enough to pose a fatal threat to the wild gods. There was, however, a galaxy of talents. Bert's body turned into a huge ball of light and began to expand in all directions. As Ramsay of the 9 Li race flashed past, a pale yellow talisman appeared in his hand. With a pat, the tentacles formed by the pale yellow lights enveloped the spreading light ball. Once tentacles had completely shrouded the light ball, the energy that it contained was blocked. What a powerful method, Zen sighed inwardly. The exiles of the 9 Li race, except Timotheus, had never demonstrated what they were capable of. But the method that Ramsay had just showed was impressive, especially since it could offset the self-explosion of a powerhouse at the other shore realm. Zen admired him for his strength. A few seconds later, the energy produced by Bert's self-explosion reached its peak and then began to rapidly fade away. At last, under the power of the yellow talisman, it disappeared. It's just the soul-sealing truth. It's not worth sighing about. Number 9527, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke up at Zen's side. The soul-sealing truth. Zen's eyes narrowed. Once Ramsay had released the talisman, Zen had felt a strong force of seal within it. He hadn't expected it to be another truth of godly way. That's right. My master has said that the truth of godly way gained through the grand world cultivation method is undoubtedly powerful, but it can't be compared with the truth. They think they have reached the other shore, but this is not true. Number 9527 said disdainfully. It wasn't in the mood to hide its feelings. You mean, they haven't reached the other shore in the real sense? Zen said, aware that he was just on the brink of being rendered speechless at No 9527's comment. Instead, he retorted, even if they haven't reached the other shore, they are far stronger than me now. That is why I haven't offered any help yet. Once they had entered this space, Emily and Timotheus had led the way. Zen, and even the elders of the various races could only hide behind the strong warriors at the other shore realm. The weakest warrior at the other shore realm was not someone the wild gods could fight. Number 9527 was not convinced. It's because they are on a higher cultivation level than you. Wait and watch. The Warden race will finally use the strength-equalizing theurgy that Herbert passed on. By then, these powerhouses at the other shore realm will definitely be stunned, and will have to rely on your falling star palm. Once Zen learned the truth crystal of the Chaos Ancient God, number 9527 taught him the methods of using it. The methods of using the truth crystal were broad and profound. Zen could not master some of them at his present stage. But the falling star palm was the Chaos Ancient God's most basic theurgy. Although Zen had mastered it to some extent, he had never used it in front of others. The truth crystal itself was not so powerful in Zen's opinion. It couldn't be as frightening as it was made out to be. Zen thought it was far weaker than the Way's blending energy. The strength-equalizing theurgy, what is it? Zen froze, almost forgetting that number 9527, a wisp of the soul of the Chaos Ancient God, knew this world better than anyone. But he didn't ask about it before, nor did number 9527 mention it. Herbert was the Chaos Ancient God who pursued the equality of all living beings. He comprehended the strength-equalizing theurgy from the godly way's great unity. He built this prison, although his body isn't here. It isn't strange for the Warden race to use the strength-equalizing theurgy when they have to, is it? Number 9527 explained patiently. Chapter 2223, Start the Strength-Equalizing Theurgy. Zen frowned slightly at these words. He was not satisfied with the power of the falling star palm, but that didn't mean that he underestimated the truth theurgy. According to what number 9527 had said, the truth should be comprehended from the fusion of godly ways. This kind of energy might be related to the nature of the entire chaos. Although Zen had condensed out the truth crystal, he hadn't mastered its essence completely. It had formed quickly because of his bloodline. On the contrary, the Warden race must be quite powerful. They believed in Herbert and carried out his orders to control the world. They must have learned many tricks from him. If so, how would Emily and Timotheus deal with it? Can I really go up against the strength-equalizing theurgy with my falling star palm? Zen asked, still not convinced. He still couldn't understand how a theurgy that did not meet actual combat requirements could be used to fight against a powerful theurgy like Herbert's. You'll know when the time comes, number 9527 replied. Since it spoke with confidence, Zen nodded and didn't ask any more questions. He followed the crowd in silence. With the formidable strength of the exiles and Zelda herself at the helm, the team had become unstoppable. Although exiles from a few small races had repeatedly attempted to assassinate the team members, the team had easily dealt with them and even killed some of those exiles. In 3 days, the team covered tens of thousands of miles in this space. When the once distant high platforms finally came into view, many of the team members' eyes lit up in excitement. After all, the expedition they had embarked on was a large one, but it had gone smoothly so far. Ever since they had entered this space, they had lost only one companion, Quentin. They had traveled the rest of the distance without meeting any great difficulty. But Emily, Timotheus, and a few other people were not as optimistic. The journey had gone far too smoothly for their taste, they couldn't help but find it abnormal. Moreover, they were not only fighting against Spark, but also against the exiles of the small races. Besides, their real opponent was the Warden race. And so far, the Warden race had not shown up or made any moves. This was the biggest worry. Zelda, does the Warden race live here? Emily asked, looking at the tall platforms. Yes, Zelda replied. She was very familiar with the place where she was born. Then, she added, these tall platforms are the towers of captivity. They're used to imprison all the living beings in the world. There are 200,000 of them in total. Every tower of captivity was connected to countless curse chains, and all the living beings in the world were trapped on the tall platforms. Can we destroy these tall platforms? Emily asked curiously. Zelda shook her head. These tall platforms were created by the Chaos Ancient God. You can't destroy them. But Leopold, a member of the 9 Li race, didn't believe her. He smiled faintly and said, let me have a try. Zelda didn't stop him because she thought that there was no harm in him trying. Whoosh! Leopold abruptly lifted himself up off the ground and clenched his fist. Soon, a black spiral of light began to circle his fist. Although the energy swirling in the spiral was extremely powerful, it had been completely contained without any energy leaking. With a loud roar, Leopold threw a punch. The black spiral turned into a black fist shadow, shooting toward one of the tall platforms. When the spiral touched the tall platform, it burst into pieces. Bang! With a loud rumble, the energy, which had been condensed to the maximum limit, exploded. If this had happened in the outside world, the earth would have been shaking by now. The mere presence of that force would have been enough to create a hurricane capable of tearing mountains apart. But here, aside from that loud noise, there was no indication that such a power had even existed. My power, it was absorbed. There was a hint of surprise on Leopold's face. However, Emily and Timotheus looked just as indifferent as before. They knew that they couldn't resist the power of the Chaos Ancient God and that anything could happen here. Emily was very clear that the people they actually relied on were Zelda and Luther. Let's go. We have to enter the center of these tall platforms, said Zelda. After seeing Leopold's failed attempt to destroy one of the tall platforms, the rest of the team walked silently into the platforms from below one after another. Deep in these tall platforms, Spark stood impatiently, his face darkening. The black light was like a venomous snake that kept shooting out and coming back. He had lost half the exiles around him, and they had all been killed by Emily, Timotheus, and the others. It had to be said that the exiles from these small races were too weak. Even though they relied on the means of the Warden race, they were still far from capable enough to fight against Emily and the others. Spark, what should we do now? Asked one of the exiles. Other than the exiles from the Yellow Emperor race, the exiles from the small races were all depressed. They had wanted to use their own strength to make those big races stay in this world, but only when they had actually faced the big races had they understood how weak they were. The gap between their strengths was so big that they were unable to make up for it. It's almost done, said Spark flatly. Hearing that, the exiles cluelessly looked at one another, they didn't know what Spark meant. As Spark turned around and looked at the central area of the high platforms, a black jade pendant appeared in his hand. With a slight pinch of his fingers, he broke the jade pendant into pieces. When the jade pendant broke, a disc with a diameter of more than 10,000 feet appeared thousands of miles away from this place. And on the disc stood hundreds of people in black cloaks. In the center of this disc was an old man with a stoop. This old man was so skinny that his face looked like a skull. He was a member of the Warden race and the leader of the conservative faction. Unexpectedly, the 2 little kids have brought them here anyway, the old man murmured. His voice was as small as an insect's, but it clearly reached everyone's ears. Spark and his companions are good for nothing. They can't stop them at all, commented a purple-haired young man standing beside the old man. The old man chuckled. There is indeed a big gap between them in strength. Ever since Emily found the two survivors, I knew this day would come. Master, should we start the strength equalizing theurgy now? A crisp female voice came from a black cloak. The old man gave a long sigh, and something unreadable flashed in his eyes. Then, finally making up his mind, he nodded slightly. At this moment, the huge disc under these cloaked people's feet began to slowly spin. Chapter 2224, Weakened. As the watchers of this world, it was safe to say that the Warden race's strength wasn't the highest. Their only duty was to maintain the world's operation. Most of the time, they didn't even need to show up in person. The space Herbert had opened for them was enough to ensure their safety, and they only needed to cast their shadows when they patrolled the world. No matter how strong the exiles were, they couldn't do anything to them. If it weren't for the conflicts between the Warden race's conservative faction and the Free faction, neither the Snake Goddess nor the Ninely race could have found this place. As the disc slowly rotated, a light blue texture suddenly appeared on its surface and gradually spread until it was completely covered. I had always thought that when the light of adjudication came, all the survivors of the Free faction would have been dead. I never figured trouble would arise at the last moment. This is our Warden race's fate, the old man said before letting out a hefty sigh. The Free faction disobeyed our master's will and we firmly believe that they will fail, the woman under the cloak said once again. The meaning of our Warden race's existence is to maintain the world's operation. We can't fail, another voice spoke out. Many conflicts in the world were caused by situations that weren't necessarily black or white. The Free faction wanted nothing more than to pursue their goal, while the conservative faction followed Herbert's orders. The exiles wanted to escape this world, and Zen wanted to return to the divine land. Click. Once the disc had spun to a certain extent, a crisp sound suddenly rang out. At that very moment, the light blue texture was now covering the entire disc. If one was to look down from the sky above, they'd see that this texture formed the exact shape of a three-eyed monkey. Buzz. As this faint blue light continued floating, it gradually rose from the disc. It turned into a light blue shadow in the image of a three-eyes monkey. Greetings, Master. All of the Warden race's members standing on the disc suddenly knelt to the ground. The old man looked solemn and devout. Although the other people were covered beneath their black robes, one could easily assume that they were wearing the same expression as the old man. They knew that Herbert wasn't actually in this world. The Master had left a long time ago and no one knew when he'd be back, but in their hearts, the Master was still a sacred being. Creak. All of a sudden, the three-eyed monkey opened its big mouth and let out a shrill scream. The overwhelming howl spread for miles. Along with the howl, countless spots of light spurted out from the three-eyed monkey's open mouth. The light spots spread in all directions. As these light spots swept past the warriors on the disc, they shot into their bodies. Even the old man, standing directly in the middle of the disc, was unable to avoid them completely. Out of nowhere, he was hit by a blue light dot and his body trembled violently. He quickly reached out and clenched his fists, smiling helplessly. My strength has weakened so much. The young man with purple hair also stretched his body and said, I feel unprecedentedly powerless, like a useless mortal and no less. I feel it too, and I definitely don't like it, said a woman under a cloak. The old man smiled faintly. Who, in their right mind, would like this? If we fight Emily and the others head on, we will definitely lose. At least now, we're all at the same level, and we have the weapons provided by our master. The peculiar light dots started spreading out from the disc, and then circled around, moving far and wide. It wasn't before long that the light spots began to spread to where Spark was. They hit him as well as the other exiles. Spark's body suddenly trembled, and his eyes opened wide with incredible emotion. He felt his soul, strength, and body begin to weaken rapidly. He could no longer feel the other shore, and even the connection with his inner world had been broken. He had no idea what was going on. This is, Spark stuttered in a trembling voice. The other exiles were in the exact same state as Spark. Each and every one of their faces displayed a trace of trembling fear. After all, they had nearly lost every ounce of strength and power they had. The Warden race had once told Spark that if his joint attack with the exiles of small races failed, then the Warden race would be forced to take action. The fact that the Warden race would even dare use such a method had never crossed his mind. What kind of theurgy is it, anyway? What's their purpose in suppressing our power to such an extent? An exile from a small race asked in confusion. An exile from the Yellow Emperor race thought for a moment, and a smile appeared on his face before he offered a response. Our strength has been suppressed, he began. So Emily and the others with her would suffer the same as us. Sparks and other exiles' eyes suddenly lit up with excitement when they heard this. They immediately realized the Warden race's intention of doing so. The blue light dots were still spreading. The energy seemed very soft, even harmless, but in fact, it was irresistible. Beneath the high platforms, Emily still walked in front, followed by the others behind her. It was then that a piercing roar suddenly pierced everyone's ears. Look, over there, what's that? Someone in the crowd had noticed the blue dots before anyone else. Emily's gaze swept across the blue light spots. She raised her eyebrows, tapped her toes on the ground, and her body quickly retreated backwards. However, these light dots spread at an extremely fast speed. Even Emily wasn't capable of dodging them without using spatial transference. As soon as the light spots penetrated her body, she let out a muffled groan and her legs went weak. She nearly fell to her knees. Everyone around her was experiencing the same thing she was. As the light spots continued touching them, they could feel their strength escaping them vigorously. The degree at which their power weakened was far beyond their imagination. What is going on here? I've never felt so weak in all my life before. Quote, Timotheus's, Leopold's, Ramsay's and the many other exiles' faces darkened at once. They didn't understand what was going on and felt furious. Is this the strength-equalizing theurgy that you've mentioned before? Zen stood still and asked number 9527 after he felt the change occurring in his body. As the light dots entered his body, he immediately felt like he had lost everything. His previously indestructible body now became extremely fragile, no different from that of a basic mortal. As number 9527 had mentioned something about the strength-equalizing theurgy to him before, Zen thus wasn't surprised. Yes, when this specific truth theurgy is activated, all the creatures in the space are weakened to the same level. Look at Emily, her strength is at the same level as yours now. Number 9527 replied. As he heard this response, Zen smiled bitterly. This isn't good news. The exiles of the large races were the most important figures and more so, everyone relied on them. If Emily, Timotheus and the other powerful warriors' strength had suddenly plummeted, then it was safe to say that this was a disaster. Chapter 2225, The Whites. Emily glared down at her hands and an unprecedented grave expression was displayed on her face. How is this even possible? She asked, feeling totally dazed. Luther, who was standing beside her, was also incredibly confused. Back when the conservative faction fought with the free faction, he had been too young and therefore, he didn't know much about the many situations that occurred in the Warden race. With a wave of his hands, Timotheus focused on his cinnabar field and took a deep breath, trying to forcefully activate the energy within his inner world. Yet, even as his face turned bright red with concentration, his cinnabar field still had no reaction whatsoever. Many of the other exiles attempted on their own behalf, in various ways. Whether they used the soul power, the pure strength, or even tried to feel the other shore, the results simply disappointed them. Ultimately, everyone focused their eyes on Zelda. Looking in the direction from which the scream came, she said flatly, that is the strength-equalizing theurgy. They've finally activated it. And what exactly do you mean by that? Emily asked with a sullen expression. Can they weaken our strength directly? If the Warden race had such a method, then they wouldn't need to be afraid of anyone. In their current state, they could only let themselves be slaughtered. If Spark attacked them now, he could kill everyone in the blink of an eye. In other words, this theurgy was simply too domineering and unreasonable. It has done much more than only weaken our strength. Zelda added, but theirs, too. Every single creature's strength has been dulled down to the same level. This is the so-called strength-equalizing theurgy. Emily paused for a brief moment, and then a bitter smile appeared on her beautiful face. Really? She asked, surprised. Zelda nodded in response. In other words, the exiles, the elders of the various races as well as the elites among the wild gods all had the exact same strength level. Right now, no one was actually much stronger than a basic, ordinary mortal. We're still in big trouble, said one of the exiles from the Stardeer race. And he was right. Now that we have come to this stage, there is no turning back. If the strength-equalizing theurgy is really like what Zelda said and it can affect everyone, then they won't be stronger than us, but we'll still have to be prepared, said Emily. Emily quickly accepted this fact. She gently patted the jade bracelet on her wrist. She could still use the Sumeru space, she thought to herself. The jade bracelet flashed with light, and a ring of glowing rays suddenly appeared in her hand. Clang! As soon as the ring appeared, it slipped out from Emily's hand and hit the ground with a loud clang. Emily frowned and tried to pick the ring back up, but she was unable to do so. It wouldn't move in the least. It was obvious to her now that her strength wasn't much higher than that of Immortal. The Palm Sky Ring was a well-known magic weapon in the Source world. Although it was a relatively light weapon, its weight was probably comparable to that of an entire mountain range. With nothing but Immortal's strength, lifting a mountain range was impossible, simply unheard of. Other exiles equally tried their weapons. However, the high-level magic weapons were all very heavy. Although they could easily use them in the past, now they had become a pile of waste. In the end, they realized that they could only use a few more practical weapons. Emily took out a sharp black saber instead. This saber was a weapon she used in the early ages, and she hadn't used it for many years. Her cultivation base had still been very low back then, and she had thus kept this black saber as a souvenir. Now, it came in handy. Timotheus, on his behalf, found a saber with a strange shape, while Ramsay found a gray spear to use. They were all ordinary weapons. A few exiles had no suitable weapons and they had to borrow weapons from each other. Zen searched in his space ring for a while hopefully, but found nothing useful. In order to enter the Divine Land, he had to leave the weapons he obtained in the universe in the celestial position. After all, once he entered the Divine Land, everything in the universe would be turned into life vitality. For Zen too, his weapons obtained in the Divine Land were very heavy all of a sudden. Out of the blue, Zelda pulled out several weapons, as if by magic, for the crowd to select. Zelda was familiar with the Warden race and knew that they would activate the strength-equalizing Theurgy. For this reason, during the 2 years she spent in the Torrent Bone Tower, she had collected quite a number of scrap metals. While she did so, a few of the Snake Goddess members felt Zelda's behavior very strange. It was only now that they realized that Zelda had already expected it, long before them. Zen picked through the pile of weapons before finally choosing a long sword and a flying knife as thin as a cicada's wings. Just as they were preparing, a roar suddenly sounded from the depths of darkness on the high platforms. Awoo! Previously, the exiles, spiritual will could cover a very vast area. Nothing within hundreds of miles could escape their detection. However, their souls had now been greatly weakened. Their detection capacities were null, and it was as if they were blind. When they heard the roar, everyone looked toward the voice's direction, but because of their cultivation loss, even their eyesight had been greatly weakened. They couldn't see clearly, and definitely not far enough. Awoo! The screeching voice sounded once more. A figure slowly walked out from the shadows. Its pace was unsteady and its movement bizarre. Only when the figure had completely walked out from the darkness did they clearly see who was standing there. It's only a white, an exile from the fire-melting race stated disdainfully. Whites were simply too common in this world. They were weak, and were easily considered the lowest-level creatures here. The more powerful wild gods didn't bother to deal with these fellows that wandered the immemorial wilderness, and it was even less likely for a group of powerful warriors in this world to take them seriously. Did you say only a white? Have you forgotten your current strength, by any chance? Another exile refuted. It was only then that the fire-melting race exile suddenly remembered what Zelda had said. If everyone had equal strength after the strength-equalizing Theurgy was activated, then the strength of this white would be on par with his. He hadn't thought of that earlier. As this thought settled within the group, everyone felt a little unsettled. Besides, there's always more than just one white, said Emily, biting her lips and frowning. Woo, 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 woo. From within the cracks beneath the high platforms, whites slowly staggered out one by one. The number of whites here was really quite high. The unintelligent zombie-like creatures could tear up any targets that came anywhere close to them. Whites don't have wisdom or weapons. We still have the advantage. Everyone, don't be discouraged. Although Emily understood the meaning of the strength-equalizing Theurgy, and more so that her strength wasn't enough for her to take charge as chief, she still stood in front of the group without hesitating in the least. The whites staggered forward for a good distance. When they realized that a pile of food had miraculously appeared in front of them, the white at the helm suddenly let out a howl. It instinctively pounced toward the group, and the others followed quickly behind. Chapter 2226, Killing. The white approached them menacingly, crawling on its hands and feet. In the past, it didn't seem to be moving very fast, and didn't seem like a threat in the eyes of Emily and the rest of the group. But now, it was clear that its speed wasn't that slow after all. Awoo! The white howled and rushed towards Emily. Emily stood straight, with her annular saber gripped tightly in her hand. The moment the white rushed to her, she suddenly stomped the ground, and her body rolled towards the white. She slammed the saber right on the white's head. The annular saber was actually ring-shaped, with sharp blades lying both on the inside and outside. After successfully positioning the annular saber on the white's head, Emily twisted it in one quick motion, breaking the white's neck. Its head fell to the ground and rolled for a while before coming to a stop. Emily's action was fast and it was all over within a blink of an eye. When the other exiles and the wild gods saw the scene, they couldn't help but applaud. Emily was very powerful, even though her strength had greatly diminished and became ordinary like everyone else, her previous experience was still substantial and her strength was undeniable. However, as she chopped off the white's head, a large amount of blood spurted from its neck. Even though she tried her best to avoid the stream of blood, it was difficult to dodge and her white clothes were now tainted with the blood. Initially, the group of exiles had felt cornered and hopeless when they saw the group of whites. But after hearing Emily's words and seeing her kill a white so easily, their confidence began to return. Even if they lost their cultivation base, strength and soul forces, they still had their rich experience and years of practice of powerful martial skills. Such whites without wisdom are nothing. Everybody, go and kill them. Charge! Timotheus roared as he rushed forward, bearing his saber on his shoulder. Dragon saber skill. With a twist of his saber, Timotheus cut a white's stomach like a dragon streaking through the sun. Then just as quickly, he pulled out the saber and spun it with both hands, making the saber twirl and spin. Ching, ching, ching. The heads of 3 whites flew off simultaneously. The dragon saber skill was not only amazing and powerful, and it was also a joy to watch. Is this saber skill also inherited from the source world? Zen was fascinated by the saber skill. He didn't expect that these exiles not only had the strong cultivation base, but also cultivated the powerful basic martial arts. Besides Timotheus, Ramsey was also good at the spear skill. He controlled and brandished his spear so well that it was like his spear was an extension of his own hand, and the whites couldn't get within 30 feet from him. More and more whites kept surging out from the darkness like a non-stop tidal wave. The group of exiles all displayed astonishing martial arts techniques. They were like an indestructible dam, firmly blocking these whites in front of them. But not much later, Zen heard a scream from behind. It turned out that the whites had been quietly sneaking up from behind them as well. Unfortunately, everyone's attention had been solely focused on the front. By the time they had realized what had happened, a large group of whites had already surrounded them from behind. An unlucky wild god from the snake goddess race failed to escape, and fell to the ground after being attacked by 4 whites, all of which were biting hard everywhere they could reach. Amy! Emily screamed as she turned around and saw the situation. Anxiety was written across her face. Amy was an elite disciple of the snake goddess race. Her strength had become more and more astonishing in the past few years. In Emily's eyes, she was a very promising protégé. Watching a disciple from her own race falling made Emily grow more and more anxious. But she had a number of whites in front of her that she had to deal with. How was she going to help Amy? Just at the right moment, a thin stream of light shot out. Poof! With a muffled sound, it landed neatly in the forehead of the white that was directly on Amy. At the same time, a figure came running towards her direction. A few rays of sharp sword light shot out from the figure's hands, and almost immediately, holes appeared in the whites' chests and necks and started oozing blood. Slowly, they fell off Amy's body too. Get up, you're safe now, Zen called as he reached out his hand to Amy, who was still lying on the ground. After the whites' attack, Amy's body was covered with wounds, but none of them were serious enough to be life-threatening. She was just in a very uncomfortable position. Amy was still too stunned after the attack and being rescued by Zen, so she didn't get up immediately. Zen. From where she was standing, Emily was equally surprised to see this scene. Although the wild gods in this world had practiced martial arts, most of them practiced the skills to make preparation for their huge physical bodies. Those wild gods were not good at physical fights. Emily knew Zen had come from a different world, but she didn't expect his swordsmanship to be so fantastic. After Zen had ensured Amy's safety, he pulled out the thin flying knife, and with a wave of his arm, he rushed towards the whites again. Most of these whites are crawling. Although their speed is very fast, their necks are exposed. With this thought in his mind, Zen's long sword swirled in the air as it swept past the bodies of these whites. Although the weapons prepared by Zelda were ordinary, the sword that Zen used was also very sharp and handy for use. Shing, shing, shing. The sword cut through the necks of the whites easily and left behind a trail of blood on them. Before those fierce whites could move any further, their heads drooped and they fell to the ground, screaming. Their bodies were paralyzed, and all they could do was to lie there waiting for death to greet them as the blood drained from their bodies. The efficiency of Zen's method was surprisingly impressive. Although there were a lot of whites coming from behind, he rushed into them alone, with only his sword as company. In just a minute, there were about 80 whites writhing on the ground after being attacked by Zen. He alone had managed to block almost half of the whites that had ambushed them from behind. Some of the other exiles had noticed Zen's brilliant method. Previously, they had used a variety of methods to kill the whites. They either penetrated their hearts, or smashed their heads, which was not very effective. But now, watching Zen's technique of killing them simply by slicing their necks, they were given new hope. Everyone immediately saw the astonishing efficiency and began following suit. In less than 5 minutes, the group of warriors had slaughtered about 4,000 whites. Woo, woo, woo. Frighteningly, the number of the whites did not seem to decrease, but kept increasing. Help! An elder from the Star Deer race suddenly yelled. The elder was being dragged into a large group of whites. In the blink of an eye, he had already disappeared into their midst, with no sign of him at all. The others could only hear his repeated calls for help, which grew weaker and weaker before disappearing altogether. At the same time, another wild god was also dragged away. More and more warriors were getting injured or killed, which upset the others and made them even easier targets. Crack! Emily heavily cut the saber down and broke the neck of a white. As the blood splashed, her charming face turned into a determined, fierce expression. This is not going to work out. We can't do this forever. She walked around and called, Timotheus, Ramsey, Lydia. As she spoke, her gaze fell on Zen who was fighting in the distance. In the same breath she continued, and Zen. All of you, come here, let's move forward together and kill those whites. Chapter 2227, Exhausted. After entering this world, Emily and the other powerful masters with her had served as the main force. She had never even thought that Zen could be someone who could help. After all, the gap between their cultivation was huge, and it was impossible for him to catch up to her. Therefore, Zen, together with the other elders, and the wild gods were all weaker people who needed her protection. At first, Emily only considered letting the many exiles, Luther, and Zelda enter this world. After all, in the eyes of the exiles, anyone else was just a burden. But after the strength-equalizing theurgy took effect, the strength Zen had displayed was no weaker than that of those exiles and even on par to that of Emily and Timotheus. Now that they were in dire need of warriors to help clear the path, Emily had naturally let Zen join them. Okay, Zen didn't hesitate at all. With a flash, he moved up from behind. In the face of the whites that were constantly advancing like a tide, they would all eventually die of exhaustion if they remained trapped here. Now, they could only pull together and fight their way out. After that, Emily ordered 2 exiles from the bigger races to bring up the rearguard, and the group began to make headway. Heavenly Light Spear. Now Ramsey blazed the way for the others, and the silver-gray spear was like lightning, launching more than 10 strikes in an instant. More than 10 whites howled in pain and fell writhing to the ground. Immediately after, 2 exiles of the snake goddess race rushed up to take the lead. One of them wielded more than 10 short swords, and the other one brandished a blade of a strange configuration. With their ferocious attacks, tens of whites were quickly butchered. Then came Timotheus, Leopold, and the others. The exiles took turns to attack and slowly forged a path to escape. Those who came behind them walked on the path of bodies as they trod over white corpses to move forward. Zen did not hesitate or relent in his attacks, and he fought fiercely. Although he couldn't use the Way's blending energy in his inner world, his swordsmanship had been perfected while cultivating in the universe. Now, his body had risen in the air, and the long sword in his hand struck down at the backs of those whites that blocked their path in quick succession. After the attacks continued for a while, both he and Emily rushed to the front line. Emily, who was in the front, was facing down a group of whites that had advanced to surround her. Her eyes flashed, and as she tapped her toes on the ground, she let out a wild shout and attacked. Swish! With a sudden twist of the saber, she broke all these whites' necks. But this time, she had ignored a white to her side. The white quietly approached, opened its big mouth, and moved to bite Emily's white neck. Under the impact of strength-equalizing theurgy, even Emily would be a mess of flesh and blood if she was bitten. Her expression changed, knowing that there was no way to avoid it, and she closed her eyes as she waited for the inevitable fangs to close in on her flesh. Bang! However, as the white's mouth was only 2 inches away from her neck, the blade of a flying knife as thin as a cicada's wings suddenly pierced into the white's forehead, knocking it to the ground where it lay twitching. A faint smile of relief appeared on Emily's face when she saw the white slowly falling down. She had never thought that she would be saved by a young man who was only at the true god realm. Then she yanked out the flying knife from the white's body using the saber in her hand, and tossed it back to Zen with a slight nod of her head. Both of them kept silent and continued to battle forward. Although the number of whites didn't decrease, they were dumb beasts, and they continued to charge forward without any other thought. As for the exiles and wild gods, they had initially panicked at the beginning, but now they had quickly calmed down, resolutely advancing with the group. They were becoming more and more skilled to fight against these whites. At first, they had suffered losses, and 6 of them had died. Later, some of the wild gods had been injured, but now no one had perished. Everyone fought valiantly as they surged forward. They advanced in this way for dozens of miles. The number of whites facing them had slowly begun to decrease. At the beginning, the whites had just flocked towards them like a mindless wave of death. Later, with the group's tenacious efforts, there were only a few of the whites standing. And in the end, they were all butchered. Now no one obstructed their way. At this point, everyone slowed their pace and eventually stopped moving forward. It wasn't that they didn't want to continue their advance. It was just that the strength-equalizing theurgy had affected them and drained them in every aspect, until even their physical strength was greatly lessened. As they had continued fighting to gain ground against the whites, most of them had completely depleted their strength. When the group members saw that the whites were no more, their tensed nerves suddenly relaxed, and they quickly collapsed to the ground. They didn't even want to move their fingers again. Even those who had mastered skills in preserving their strengths began to gasp heavily for air. And Timotheus, Emily, and the other warriors were no exception. Emily was covered in splatters of white blood and other smaller bits of white bodies. She lifted a corner of her dress and wrung it, producing a gush of blood from the soaked fabric. While she was wringing the blood out of her dress, her gaze quietly settled on Zen, who was calmly sitting opposite to her. A surprised expression had formed on her face. After the strength-equalizing theurgy had taken effect on everyone, their strengths became about the same. Now many exiles were utterly exhausted, but only Zen looked calm and relaxed. Aren't you tired? Emily asked, both curious and surprised. I'm fine, Zen replied with a smile. He had killed a number of whites more than those that Emily had slain. It was likely that he had killed the most whites from the whole group. He should have been exhausted. But Zen was using a special kind of swordsmanship. The sword skills he had practiced were distilled to their simplest form. He used the most economical movement to get the best effect. Every time he had brandished the sword, it had consumed only a little bit of physical strength, and therefore, he looked less tired than the others. Let's take a breather, Emily said lightly. For now we certainly don't have to move on. These once powerful exiles now had to rest like the ordinary mortals. Otherwise, the energy they had consumed would become irreparably lost. In many of the exiles' eyes, this was an absurd thing. After all, the physical energy that had been expended was not nearly as much as a billionth of the physical strength they had possessed before. However, they all had to consider that the strength-equalizing theurgy was domineering, and their massive strengths had been reduced to that of mere mortals now. Okay, I'll be the lookout, Zen nodded. Emily nodded vaguely and settled against a corner. She leaned back against the pillars at the base of the high platform and closed her eyes helplessly. She couldn't remember when last she had closed her eyes to sleep. It might even have been many tens of thousands of years ago. Perhaps she was too tired, for she drifted off to sleep in a few seconds. As for the other exiles and wild gods, they were also soon snoring in a bone-weary sleep. Zen plunged his long sword into the ground and swept his gaze over these warriors. A smile spread over his face. It was indeed strange that the mighty exiles had run out of energy. Now that everyone had fallen asleep, Zen sat cross-legged and quietly began to meditate, circulating his bloodline theurgy. When they had fought the whites just now, number 9527 had urged him continuously to activate the bloodline theurgy and use the falling star palm to vanquish the enemy. The strength-equalizing theurgy was also a truth theurgy. No one could resist an attack that used the truth theurgy. All the souls, their physical bodies, the life vitality from inside their inner worlds, and the wild god power were made equal, to the same level as that of mortals. Even all the visual acuity and physical strength of the creatures were made equal. However, number 9527 had told Zen that only the truth theurgy could not be affected. Chapter 2228, Conversation. Throughout the whole chaos, the low-level power would be suppressed by the high-level power. Those who had been known to hold the supreme power were the chaos ancient gods. So, when the strength-equalizing theurgy was activated, it had the power to suppress everything. The exiles took pride in their own strength and were powerful, but they were not much stronger than the mortals now. Even the power they had obtained from the other shore couldn't contend against the strength-equalizing Thurgi. On the other hand, it was not the same case for Zen. His bloodline Thurgi was also a truth Thurgi, which could avoid the suppression of the strength-equalizing Thurgi. Zen finally understood what number 9527 meant after the strength-equalizing Thurgi was activated. Although his bloodline Thurgi didn't contain much power, the power was at the high level. Buzz. An extremely slight chirp resounded from Zen's body. A trace of green light eventually appeared and danced gently on his palm. This green light slowly bounced up and quickly turned into a small green cube. For now, he had no idea what kind of ability was hidden in the Blood's Truth Thurgi. With the guidance of number 9527, he could make use of the Thurgi, Falling Star Palm. He flipped his palm slightly, and the small green cube slowly spread out, merging into his palm. His entire palm suddenly was completely dyed green. His gaze then looked at a distance as his fingers slightly clenched. The green light in his hand had already dissipated before he employed the Falling Star Palm. Zen didn't want to attract too much noise. Since the Warden race had activated the strength-equalizing Thurgi, there must be some other means. Before the Warden race used those methods, Zen wouldn't easily expose his own means. Right now, the exiles and wild gods were still in deep sleep, engrossed in their own dreams, and some were even snoring. They hadn't slept so soundly for a long time. After a peaceful time of rest, 10 hours had already passed. Emily was the first one to wake up. Perhaps due to a good sleep, she habitually became vigilant and almost reflexively jumped up. Not once in her thought that she would sleep soundly like this, this was unimaginable in the past. When Emily saw that Zen was still up and on guard, she let out a sigh of relief and asked, "How long has it been?" "About 10 hours, Zen answered. "I'm sorry, I didn't expect that I would fall asleep for so long." Emily looked at the exiles who were sleeping randomly. She forced a smile and said, "It seems that everyone is like this." Everyone's strength and ability were almost the same, but there were still small differences. One difference was with Emily's recovery speed. Her speed in recovering was much faster, which helped her in waking up earlier than the rest. "Don't you need to rest?" Emily glanced at Zen. "I'm not sleepy," Zen answered as he shook his head. He originally thought that the reason he wasn't that tired compared to them was because he had consumed less physical energy. But the moment he activated the bloodline Thurgi, he noticed that it sustained him more energy. Analyzing the situation, he found out that he could keep such a good state because of the blood of the Chaos Ancient God. Emily stared at Zen with a surprised expression. When Timotheus brought over and introduced Zen, it had subconsciously sparked a hint of curiosity to her. She saw that Zen was just a true god. It was true that his talent had astonished her, but his strength was not something special in her eyes. She had led a group of people to break into this world, and never even noticed the young man. There was nothing special that he did after all. She had not expected that after the attack of the strength-equalizing Thurgi, Zen's ability eventually had been displayed, which had truly surprised her. After the exiles, strength had been equalized, they could still be stronger than the wild gods, relying on their powerful resources. However, Zen was only a true god. Emily's curiosity had grown as she continued to observe him. She took 2 steps forward and folded her dress stained with blood. She sat next to Zen and asked, "You also seem to want to leave this world, right?" The exiles had longed to leave this place, but many of the wild gods were not willing to leave this place. After all, this was their hometown. If they left the massive wild bones, they would even find it extremely difficult to cultivate. Zen sat still and looked at the huge platforms far away. He smiled faintly and said, "Of course." It had already been a few years when he left the Divine Land. Probably a lot had changed as he knew nothing about the current situation. He was deeply worried since the situation in the Divine Land was not really good when he left. Would his mother be captured by Nicholas? Would she die along with those holy beings? What about Yan, Lavender and Letitia in the fairy palace? Zen couldn't help but be concerned about those who were left behind, the people who were close to his heart. As soon as Emily brought up the question, his heart was once filled with worry and longing. A hint of sadness had appeared in his eyes. "It looks like there are important people in the ship," Emily uttered. Emily had already planned to gather all the power of the exiles from the snake goddess race and would forcefully pull down the ship. "Of course," Zen nodded. "All of my family are there, and so are my enemies." Emily was well aware about the origin of the Divine Land and the grudge between Chiyu and the Yellow Emperor. However, after she was imprisoned in this prison, she did not know what happened to the source world afterwards. She now knew that the Nine Li race had weakened and it even forced Chiyu to build a ship. The ship would then help their race flee from the source world. Your enemies must be Yellow Emperor's men, or namely the Yellow Emperor guards, right? Emily once again inquired. In this world, the Yellow Emperor race and the Snake Goddess race were considered to just be in simple states. Both races were complicated in the source world. Yes, everything that had happened was because of those Yellow Emperor guards, Zen stated. The Yellow Emperor guards also supported Nicholas. Zen never had an encounter with the Yellow Emperor guards before, but the reason why the Divine Land would be reduced to its current level now was because of them. If he were to return to the Divine Land, he would face them sooner or later. If we can leave this world, I will help you kill them all, Emily said with a smile. She wasn't clear about the strength of the Yellow Emperor guards, but she was confident in offering a helping hand. Are you willing to meddle in this matter? Zen asked curiously. Zen had never been to the source world before, but he knew that the competition between these great races was full of various interests. If he could really leave this world, he naturally hoped that Timotheus, Ramsay, Leopold and the other strong warriors from the Nine Li race would come back to the Divine Land with him. He didn't expect that Emily would offer to stand by him. Why not? Emily kept the smile on her face as her eyes flashed. As long as I can leave this world. With the current situation for the exiles, there would be no room for retreat. Chapter 2229, Sneak Attack. Initially, Emily was confident that she could defeat anyone who blocked her as she tried to leave this world. To her, she saw the Warden race as hidden bugs, unable to be seen. But now that they were right in front of her, they had to prepare for their deaths. What she didn't expect was that the Warden race would activate the strength equalizing theurgy. As her strength weakened, she had no idea if she could leave the world. She grew anxious. Don't worry. Zen slowly stood up. Luck has always been on my side. I don't think it'll fail me just yet. To her surprise, Zen seemed to be frighteningly confident. Soon enough, her worried face was replaced by a faint smile. This young man was so interesting, she thought. At this moment, the other exiles and wild gods also woke up one after another. After a brief rest, they continued forward. In the depths of the platforms, Spark and a few others walked along another road in silence. After the strength equalizing theurgy was completely exerted, their strength rapidly diminished as well. This brought many inconveniences that the people weren't used to. Luckily, the Warden race had arranged everything beforehand. All they had to do was follow as Spark had instructed. They are as weak as we are now, so are the arrogant Emily, Spark whispered. And we have the help of these whites. I believe you know what to do next. Lined up and ready, each of these exiles held a jet black bow in their hands. These were the most common bows, used by mortals. The bowstrings had been tightened, and the black arrows were also in place. The heads of the arrows glowed with a faint black light. Though they seemed intimidating, these bows posed no threat in the eyes of the exiles. In the past, even they were shot by 1,000 or more arrows, they never got hurt. But right now, they were lethal. Got it, one of the exiles responded, a sinister smile spreading across his face. For a few of them, leaving the world might not be that important now. In fact, they would be very happy if they could kill Emily and the others. Spark then fished out a cloth bag and took out some black, pungent medicine cakes. You know, those whites can't even distinguish friends from foes, and they literally eat anything that moves, he explained as he gave out the medicine cakes. Take these cakes and your bodies would give off the same smell, and then none of them will approach you. Though this was an underrated trick, it was important to make do of what they could after the strength equalizing theurgy affected everyone. Without hesitation, the exiles took the medicine cakes from Spark and swallowed them whole. They all had the hardest time keeping them down, but they all knew it was necessary. After everyone got ready, Spark said, "They are almost here. Tyler, you led 3 people to a position, which is in the southwest. And Faulkner, you go to B position, which is in the northeast." All the high platforms were strategically arranged according to the positions of the 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches. Between these high platforms, there were a large number of whites that were imprisoned there. They would let them out after Emily and her companions entered. Tyler immediately led several people and quickly snuck into the shadows. Between the 2 high platforms in the southwest, thousands of whites were locked behind the thick bars. Those whites imprisoned inside resembled sculptures, standing motionlessly without any trace of life force on their bodies. Though Tyler and the rest had seen a lot in the world, they were still very bothered by the scene. "Tyler, what do you think that has happened to these whites?" one of them muttered. They had all seen whites before, but they never knew their origins or purposes. They had always been mysterious creatures altogether. Seeing them right there, in between alive and dead, bothered the exiles to their stomachs. Seeing the motionless whites, Tyler shook his head. Even if they reached the other shore, they still couldn't seem to understand why the Chaos Ancient God would do this. It was something beyond their understanding. No matter what, be quiet now and be ready, Tyler said in a low voice. This move would decide the victor and loser. If we succeed, we will have the chance to leave this world for good. As they lurked, they did their best to remain as silent as possible. An hour had passed and they began to hear faint footsteps from afar. Turning to the direction where the sound came from, Tyler and the others saw figures coming towards them. They are coming, Tyler said in a low voice. At this moment, a clicking sound began to come from the fences beneath the tall platforms. The fences began to move, retracting into the ground. At the same time, all the sculpture-like whites had become alive right there. They let out screams and rushed towards Tyler and the rest. Seeing this, one of the exiles was discouraged. He lifted the bow in his hand, ready to shoot and kill. Seeing this, Tyler rushed over to put his hand on the gear of the bow and stopped him. Don't move. As the whites approached, they roared and suddenly rushed the opposite direction. It seemed that the smelly medicine worked. Tyler and the others let out a huge sigh of relief. However, on the other side, they are coming again. When Zen, Emily and the others saw the whites rushing over, they still remained composed. Everyone raised their weapons, ready for battle against the group of whites. Because they had enough rest, everyone was pumping with adrenaline and energy. These whites could hardly get close to them as they were quickly killed by the exiles. Puff, puff, puff. As everything became hectic, Emily was like a deaf spirit, walking among the whites. She used the saber as a prop, and it looked like she was dancing as she killed them one by one. Not far away, Zen's killing was no less efficient than hers. The two of them took the lead, killing off more than half of the whites on their own. However, just as they were crazily killing, behind a high platform, several bows had already been quietly raised. Tyler, who ended up hiding in the darkness, aimed at Emily in the front, while the other three had locked their own targets. As soon as Tyler gave the order, everyone released their arrows in synchronization, swish, swish, swish. Several black arrows shot out, like black rain pouring out from the darkness. Chapter 2230, Run towards his enemy. 4 arrows shot from the darkness, 3 of which flew towards Emily and 1 aimed for Zen. The exiles, however, were well aware that the large races originally targeted Luther, who was in the crowd, and not Emily. Yet, Luther was surrounded by several wild gods who formed a barricade around him. He was tightly guarded, which left little room for the enemy to attack. Therefore, the enemies had set their sights on Emily when they started to move. Perhaps, the exiles from the small races did not harbor a deep hatred towards Emily. Maybe they simply wanted to eliminate the most powerful person in the world with their own hands when the chance came. On the other hand, Tyler's target was Zen, who was next to Emily. Not long ago, Zen, who had suddenly appeared when the 9 Li race and the Yellow Emperor race had competed for the Sky South Bone Tower, had made Tyler's disciple David suffer too much. He later returned to the Pyramid Bone Tower, never to rise again. That was why Tyler deeply loathed Zen. Then, Zen displayed his mighty strength after the strength equalizing theurgy was performed, which caused Tyler to be more fearful of him. Thus, he obviously wouldn't let go of the opportunity to kill his enemy. Puff. Zen lifted his long sword and went straight for a white's neck. Then, he stepped on its back and jumped high into the air. At that moment, he caught a glimpse of a few black rays of light from afar, and all of them flew at a high speed. Watch out, there are hidden arrows being shot, he warned Emily. He then reflexively twisted his body in the air and brandished his long sword at the same time. There was a crisp sound when the arrow that was aimed at him bounced away. Meanwhile, Emily had also noticed the 3 sharp arrows that were aimed at her when Zen shouted. Her sensibility had been greatly reduced when the strength equalizing theurgy worked. Thus, she had only noticed the arrows when they were just about 8 feet away from her. Her face darkened, she knew that she couldn't dodge, so she stretched out her hand and grabbed the white nearest to her. She quickly pulled it and the white blocked her in front. Puff, puff, puff. There were 3 muffled sounds, 2 arrows had stabbed the white's body, and 1 pierced through Emily's collarbone. A small stream of blood flowed from Emily's neck as she groaned in pain. She immediately cut the white's throat with her saber, and then hurriedly retreated. Dang it, she is so quick, said Tyler in shock. His hands quickly fumbled for another black arrow and quickly tightened the bowstring. The first round of assassination was very important. After all, the enemy had no idea about it, and thus they were not on high alert. That was why Spark assigned Tyler, one of the important people in their race, to lead the group. It never occurred to Spark that the four of them didn't do any significant harm to the enemy except slightly hurt Emily. Although the first round of arrows didn't kill anyone, all of them panicked when they saw that Emily was injured. There are more hidden arrows being shot. Left front. Leave, now. It was originally already quite difficult for them to fight against the whites, and even more so if they still had to watch out for the hidden arrows. The pressure would just naturally increase, which was why they began to retreat. Don't panic, I'll deal with those guys, Zen shouted. After that, he swiftly jumped up once again and rushed forward alone. The dense pack of whites ahead made Zen's figure look a bit strange. He constantly jumped from left to right and progressed in a rather weird path. It was the sword step, which he hadn't used for a long time. The sword step was just a kind of bodily movement skill that didn't need to be activated by life vitality. Of course, it could be played freely even with the restriction of the strength equalizing theurgy. Each of his steps was 3 feet and 3 inches, which was as long as a sword, but it was changeable and complicated. The brainless whites rushed towards Zen, but they never got shorter than 2 inches away from him. He had passed by hundreds of the whites in a row, but they never even touched his clothes. In the darkness, Tyler grimaced when he saw Zen had gotten closer to them. Keep shooting. The 4 men tightened their bowstrings and after he had given the order, fired the second round of arrows at Zen without hesitation. Swish, 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 swish. 4 beams of black light came and whistled in the air, all headed straight for Zen. Zen, however, moved along with the group of whites at such a constant, high speed. How could they possibly shoot him? Poof, 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 poof. The air was filled with 4 shrill sounds, all from the 4 arrows that had hit some of the whites instead. By that time, Zen was already about 700 feet away. He was now only 1,000 feet away from where Tyler and his companions were hiding. That's quick. This guy's bodily movement skill is really amazing. How could he cultivate an ordinary martial arts skill to such a degree? Does he know the strength equalizing theurgy and did he prepare for this? Now, the situation of the wild gods and the exiles was chaotic. They were afraid that no one could deal with the arrows being fired in the dark because Emily had been hurt. In the end, they chose to retreat. Tyler never expected that Zen could move so nimbly that he could freely traverse through the crowd of whites, and left the archers with nothing to deal with. Generally speaking, all the exiles were proficient in martial arts. Yet even in the source world, ordinary martial arts were just the transitional product before the practice of the grand world cultivation method. Only a small number of people, such as Emily, Timotheus, and Ramsey, were highly skilled in these martial arts. What they did not know was that there was no true God in the universes. Everyone got into the godly way through practicing martial arts, and practicing martial arts was the basis of their cultivation. Mike could have forcefully raised Zen's cultivation base, but he didn't. Instead, he had created many training opportunities that pushed Zen to his limits in his inner world, and that made him who he was now. No one was sure if Mike had foreseen it, but at that moment, the martial arts that Zen had been cultivating did play an important role. Therefore, the wild gods and the exiles were so excited to see Zen in action. It greatly boosted their spirits. Everyone, stay in your formations. Don't panic, Emily ordered. She had already pulled out the arrow from her collarbone, but had to bear the sharp pain. Her eyes glowed strangely as she watched Zen's figure shuttle through the whites. She had always led her team, and even the powerful Timotheus listened to her command. However, she didn't expect that Zen unconsciously played the dominant role now. Shoot again, Tyler yelled with gritted teeth as he abruptly waved his hand. Things had now gotten out of hand and it made him boil in anger. According to the original plan, they would never lose as long as those whites caught up with Emily and her companions while they attacked them with sharp arrows. He never thought that the inconspicuous youth called Zen would come to them alone. Poof, 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 poof. They shot 4 arrows simultaneously once more, but none of them even managed to hurt a hair of Zen. I'm going to kill him with my own hands, Tyler yelled with a murderous look, and then drew out a saber from his waist. Chapter 2231, A Fierce Battle. Before Tyler could even draw out his saber, Zen had already passed the whites. He raised his sword and rushed into the shadows. When Zen charged in at first, he had attracted a large group of whites. The fragrance of medicine emitted by Tyler and the others scared those creatures, so they never followed them. That very moment Zen came through, a beam of blade light slashed towards him. All of a sudden, Zen realized something and placed his long sword horizontally right in front of him. Clang! The collision of the sword and the saber sent Zen a few steps backward. When his eyes had already adapted to the darkness, he finally saw the person before him clearly. Zen raised his eyebrows and smiled. Tyler. So, we meet again. Indeed, Zen had faced that man before. When the Yellow Emperor race and the Nine Li race fought against each other, that exile controlled David as he battled against Zen. Later, he was forced out of the void by that arrow shot by No. 9527. At that particular time, he was in a helpless state. Back then, there was a huge gap between Zen and Tyler in terms of strength, which was very difficult to narrow out. After all, Tyler had already reached the other shore realm. Tyler nonchalantly stared at Zen. Not long ago, he could easily kill Zen with just a wave of his hand. Now that everyone became equal due to the strength equalizing theurgy, Zen had become Tyler's strong opponent, which displeased him a great deal. With an untamed smile, he told Zen, "You're only a true god. How dare you assume that you're my match?" As soon as he finished speaking, he immediately swung his saber towards Zen. Clang, 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 along with those three crisp sounds, Zen himself had retreated 3 steps backward. Tyler's saber skill was very powerful. In the source world, he successfully became an outstanding warrior from an ordinary man by doing it step by step. He went through a lot of fatal battles and had survived countless dangers. When he became an other shore realm warrior, Tyler managed to restrain his behavior for many years while imprisoned in that world, seldom taking action. The current situation had awakened his ferocity. When he wielded and flourished his saber, he only meant to attack violently and did not just defend himself. Although there were many flaws in his body, Zen didn't have time to attack them as he had to dodge the saber first. If he prioritized attacking Tyler first, he could be split in half. This saber skill, Zen was stunned, he could only temporarily avoid Tyler's attacks. With each and every strike, Tyler became more aggressive. He didn't plan on giving Zen a break. Clang, 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 Tyler put more force in every fatal attack he made. Zen's steps were steady, and his long sword acted as a shield that blocked Tyler's every pounce. He rushed in to prevent those people from secretly releasing arrows. As long as Emily, Timotheus, and the others killed the whites, they could come and help him. As long as Zen held on, his goal could be achieved. However, he didn't expect Tyler to have such a quick temper and was just charging towards him non-stop. "You, go to perdition." With gritted teeth, Tyler pulled Zen's sword away and marched towards him. That move put him in danger. In that case, Zen could easily chop him in half using his sword. But if Zen chose to do such a thing, he could potentially be smashed into pieces. After all, Zen's body was not made out of steel. When he realized that Tyler's saber was about to hit him, Zen's eyes flashed. He suddenly moved at a rapid speed. To avoid the attack, he almost pressed himself against the blade. As a result, his clothes were ripped apart. As he tried to dodge the attack, Zen raised his arm and pointed his elbow onto Tyler's face. Tyler's attack was savage, but his face had actually crashed against Zen's elbow. With a loud crack, Tyler's nose broke, blood gushing out of it in his mouth. The pain made him curl up into a ball. With an ordinary expression plastered on his face, Zen took his chance and gently swung his long sword to stab Tyler. However, 3 exiles also charged towards Zen. They weren't able to keep up with both Zen and Tyler at first, but now that Tyler had stopped, they found their chance to meddle in. Ding, ding, suddenly, Zen's long sword bent and swept across in a rather relaxed manner. The sword tip pointed somewhere else with precision while he struggled to use it to dodge the attacks. Then, the 3 exiles' weapons were blocked and pushed away by Zen's long sword. That shocked the 3 exiles. They didn't expect that Zen had such skillful swordsmanship. They grew very afraid. Unfortunately, they had no choice but to save Tyler, who was their mainstay. Right after the 3 of them were taken aback, they prepared for another attack. That time, Zen's eyes went dark. If he was going to kill Tyler, then he needed to kill those 3 first. As that thought entered his mind, the long sword in his hand began to move faster. Facing the exile who used an axe on him, he gently lifted his sword and slashed it towards him, right along the axe helve. Realizing that his hands were about to be cut off by the sword, the exile became so terrified that he threw his weapon away. Zen took his chance and pointed the sword tip at the man's face. Upon witnessing the scene, the other 2 exiles tried their best to stop Zen's strike to save their companion. However, Zen then withdrew his sword. It was just a fake attack. Instead, he went for the exile who held a dagger. Puff, The long sword flashed with a short sword light, which swept past the exile's throat and cut off his entire neck. Thick blood flowed out of the wound. What a cunning boy! The two other exiles, holding the axe and the sword, had a distressed look on their faces. It seemed as if they were grieving. Although the three of them came from different races, they took care of one another in that world and had become close friends. They had a wonderful relationship over the years and treated each other like blood brothers. Now that one of them was badly hurt, they grew very angry. If only the exile's cultivation base was still high like before, such an injury was nothing. However, their bodies weren't stronger than that of mortals now, so that wound was enough to kill him. Arg! The remaining two exiles let out a roar and immediately pounded towards Zen. At the same time, Tyler, who had recovered, wiped the blood off his face and also rushed towards Zen with his saber clutched tightly in his hand. The three exiles put their lives at risk fighting a true god. Facing three bold guys, Zen felt more pressure. If he kept retreating, he would be in so much danger. Then, they heard the sound of footsteps not far away. Zen had been facing the four men by himself for such a long time. After a while, Timotheus managed to lead a group of people to head towards Zen. Chapter 2232, Astonishing End. As Timotheus led Leopold, Ramsey and the others, they didn't rush to the back of the tall platforms immediately. They had already attracted enough attention from most of the whites. For them, Zen's safety was their topmost priority. And for that, they had to eliminate the whites that surrounded them first. After all, they didn't know that Tyler and the others had eaten the medicine cakes. Hence, the whites would not be following them towards the shadow behind the tall platforms. Behind the huge columns of the tall platforms, Tyler's face twitched slightly. He realized that their only means to escape was by killing Zen. Tyler definitely did not want to die a pitiful death like other exiles from the smaller races. With this definite thought, his attack became even more aggressive. Forget you. With a determined effort, Tyler brought down the blade, with all his strength. Instinctively, Zen raised his sword to block the attack in front of him. By now, everyone's physical strength had weakened almost to the same level. Despite putting in his entire effort, he was no match for Tyler's attack. Bang! With a cracking sound, the long sword in Zen's hand flew out. Now is the time. Although the other two exiles had pledged their lives, they remained unsuccessful in defeating Zen. That was why, until now, they were getting extremely anxious. Tables changed for them, when unexpectedly, the sword in Zen's hand was chopped away by Tyler with one swoop of the blade. As they witnessed the scene unravel before them, they quickly approached him with a delightful expression. Soon an axe and a sharp sword went sailing towards Zen. With the saber in his hand, Tyler followed the two exiles, displaying a vicious smile. His plan was to cut off Zen's head as soon as he was hit by the sword. Even though Zen continued to dodge them at a remarkable speed, it was difficult to fight with bare hands. Suddenly, Zen had a faint smile while staring at Tyler, as he slowly raised one of his hands. Death knocks at your door, but I applaud your courage to pretend to be strong, Tyler sneered. No one, including the exiles, could resist the power of the strength-equalizing theurgy. Tyler was puzzled with Zen's sudden change in behavior. Just as the axe was about to chop Zen's head, Zen's palm suddenly glowed with a dazzling green light. Buzz! The energy was buzzing with heightened power. A small green cube formed in the blink of an eye and quickly injected into Zen's hand. Now Zen possessed a green right hand. He tried to grab the axe that was hurled at him. Even though it was merely an ordinary weapon, because of the strength-equalizing theurgy, whoever was hit by the axe would be immediately split into two. Moreover, the exile had put in all his efforts to slash Zen with the axe. But Zen suddenly twisted his right hand and easily grabbed the axe. The exile who held the other end of the axe was stunned. He grabbed the handle of the axe and tried to furiously pull it back. However, the axe hardly budged, as if it was embedded in a rock. Whose turn is it to die now? Zen smirked as he slightly applied pressure on the axe. The axe was made of pure iron, but with Zen's slight pressure, it completely lost its form. Tyler and the other exile with a sword were completely baffled at the ongoing scene. Although their senses had been weakened, they were on high alert. They knew that Zen had used some kind of powerful energy to counterattack. Even the powerhouses at the other shore realm had been subjected to the strength-equalizing theurgy. Then how could Zen escape its power? For a moment, they thought that their eyes played some tricks. But soon they realized that what they witnessed was for real. In fact, they could feel the strength emitting from Zen's right hand. As the exile continued to be in a daze, Zen grabbed the axe and hacked the exile furiously. Bang! The handle of the axe, which had an arm's thickness, smashed into the exile. There was no way he could withstand such a force. Immediately his skull cracked open, as his brains oozed out. He simply collapsed and died on the spot. Since Zen had chosen to use the Thurgy, he decided to go on full throttle and mercilessly wipe out his opponents. Bang! He continued to violently wave the axe. The exile who held the sword came to his senses. As he turned to avoid the axe, he was whacked down with the axe handle. He faced a similar end as that of his teammate. Now, Tyler was the only one left. How did you manage to do it? Does the strength equalizing Thurgy not work on you? How is that even remotely possible? Tyler said in a trembling voice, but maintained calm composure on the outside. Of course it has its effects on me, Zen said as he gently kneaded the axe with his right hand. The axe that was made of fine iron was being shaped like a soft dough, transforming its shape under his constant kneading. But I know of a way to dodge its effects. It was for this purpose that he had broken the rule made by the Chaos Ancient God. Tyler had no difficulty in believing Zen. It was proof enough to watch Zen's hand continue to glow. He gritted his teeth and mustering all his strength, threw his saber at Zen and ran away. Clang! Zen raised the handle of the axe and easily fended off the saber. Watching Tyler run away, he raised his right hand. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. As the huge axe was constantly waved, the air around crackled. Suddenly, Zen hurled the axe towards Tyler. Since he had already released the power of the Truth Crystal, there was no way he could spare Tyler. The axe sped up in the air and in the blink of an eye, caught up with Tyler. At the right moment, Tyler ducked his head and the axe flew over him. Tyler was relieved to escape from the axe. He had maintained a distance from Zen, so that he could escape, if need be. But his relief was short-lived as he instantly heard a howling sound. Something is not right. A cold dread crept over him. The next moment he was stabbed by a thin flying knife. It resembled the wing of a cicada. Still at a distance, Zen slowly put down his right hand and shook it slightly. He slowly walked towards Tyler, as the green light on the surface of his arm disappeared. At the same time, Timotheus and the others also got rid of the whites. Go help Zen, Timotheus hollered to the others. He sped up and rushed to the back of the high platforms. But when they arrived, they were stunned by what unfolded before them. Zen was pulling out the flying knife from Tyler's back when he heard footsteps behind him. He faintly smiled as he heard their gasps. That is Tyler. You killed all of them alone. Leopold couldn't believe what he saw. They were all members of the large races and knew that it would not be easy to deal with Tyler, especially under the effect of the strength equalizing Thurgy. But Zen defied all their beliefs, as he rushed over alone and killed the 4 exiles. This was definitely not what they had expected. Chapter 2233, Stealth. Zen wiped the blood on the flying knife and gave Leopold a nod. Leopold, on the other hand, could only stare at Zen with wide-eyed shock. How in the world did you make it? Everyone was at the same level of strength. Even if Zen was an expert in martial arts, it would still take him a considerably long time to kill them. Moreover, those people were healthy, strong men. They might not be a match for Zen, but they could still give him a tough time or even escape. Timotheus and the others were also puzzled. It was not difficult to kill a white with no intelligence. However, they had no chance in winning against 4 exiles on their own. Not even Timotheus was confident he could kill them. Zen merely shrugged. They were weaker than I expected. He wasn't in the mood to explain. The others were clearly unsatisfied with his simple reply but couldn't really say anything. Besides, the more powerful Zen was, the more beneficial it would be for them in the end. With that, Zen picked up his sword and collected the crossbows Tyler and his companions left behind. The crossbows were normal weapons but proved themselves quite useful. As he tidied up the mess, the group of people who disposed of the whites slowly caught up with them. Emily was at the helm. Her eyes immediately fell on Tyler's body and she raised her eyebrows in intrigue. The exiles that she, Timotheus and the others had killed were not that strong and came from small races. Tyler, however, was different. He was someone important in the Yellow Emperor race and was far stronger than ordinary exiles. Seeing him dead like this was shocking. You're so efficient. Did Zen rush in without getting hurt? She asked, looking at Zen and noticing that he was completely unharmed. She truly thought he had been a bit too impulsive and couldn't help but stare at him with concern. Timotheus and the others could only grin helplessly. We did nothing. By the time we arrived, Zen had already killed them. What? Emily exclaimed, yet her eyes visibly twinkled. The exiles of the fire-melting race, the star deer race, and the other big races could only stare at Zen with amazement. Zen only smiled at Emily but refused to explain anything. He simply pointed at the corpses on the ground. These people must have taken some type of special medicine that gives off fragrance. The whites don't dare approach them because of it. The whites had given them a lot of trouble ever since the strength equalizing theurgy was activated. There was still the strong fragrance that emanated from the corpses and they could take advantage of it at this critical moment. It was then that Emily saw that look in Zen's eyes as if he had a hidden trump card she didn't know about. However, whatever this trump card might be, Zen had no intention of talking about it. Emily smiled to herself and decided to shift the topic to the corpses. In that case, maybe we can use these corpses to avoid those whites, she suggested. Yes, Zen nodded affirmatively. When our enemies hid behind the high platforms, we became like sitting ducks as they launched their attack. We can't move forward like this. Their enemies released a massive horde of whites that charged at them earlier, leaving them no choice but to go on the defensive. Had Zen not been there and rushed forward, many of their people might have ended up dead. It was not good to proceed with this threat over their heads. Then what do you think we should do? An old man from the fire-melting race grunted. Emily had been leading them all this time, so they naturally looked up to her as their leader. She was the strongest in terms of cultivation base and thus had the ability to make others follow. They were a bit uncomfortable with the fact that she seemed to listen to Zen's advice. The young man no doubt proved himself when he killed the 4 exiles on his own, but his low cultivation base made a few people somewhat wary. We can divide ourselves into 2, Zen replied. Divide into 2? How? One of the exiles asked. Zen smiled. I will make a group, comprised of myself, and you will be the other group. Some of them could only look at him in confusion. It was Emily who eventually understood what he meant, but she frowned at the suggestion. Won't that be dangerous? You're gonna be all alone. I can go with you. Even after the activation of the strength equalizing theurgy, Emily and her group remained unafraid of Spark. They had strength in numbers after all. They were all now equal in strength. The problem though was that their enemies had the advantage of being in the dark and their group was too conspicuous in the light. If they went on like this, it was only going to be a matter of time before their enemies overwhelmed them. Zen made this suggestion so as to hide himself as well. Emily was naturally worried about him. That's right, it'll be too dangerous to go alone. Shall I, Ramsey, and Emily join you? Timotheus suggested. However, Zen shook his head. You guys are too eye-catching. They'll immediately notice if you guys leave the group. I'll be the most secure on my own. Also, Zen had the precedent to kill Tyler and the other 3. Despite his idea being so dangerous, Timotheus and the others had no choice but to agree with his plan. Countless roads crisscrossed underneath the dense platforms. The group went on ahead while Zen disappeared to go off on his own. He passed through the darkness on one side of the platforms, thousands of feet away from the group. Taking their past experiences into consideration, everyone maintained their silence and vigilance. They were always on guard against any arrow that might suddenly be shot out of the darkness. As Emily led the crowd through a 10-mile journey, a murmur suddenly came from behind a tall platform. They are here, still led by Emily. Tyler and the 3 haven't returned yet. Did they fail? Maybe he did and couldn't escape. So we must run if we can't defeat them. According to Spark's plan, different teams comprised of 4 people would attack Emily and her group with crossbows. Once they had launched their attack, they were to immediately run back and gather at the rear to prepare for the next round. If successful, this plan could effectively eliminate Emily and her team. However, Tyler and his companions didn't escape, which made this team that hid behind the pillars feel restless. Don't think too much about it. Release the whites, one of them ordered. With a crack, the fences between 2 high platforms suddenly disappeared. The whites that had been trapped beforehand suddenly rushed forward like a tidal wave while the 4-man team set up their bows and arrows. Just as they took their aim, a flash of green light suddenly blinded them. Ah, where did this light come from? One of them murmured in confusion, turning his head to look for the source. He came face to face with Zen, who stood not that far away from them. His right hand glowed green, from which he held a flying knife as thin as a cicada's wing. What was most unsettling was the way his eyes seemed to shine in the darkness. Chapter 2234, The Encounter. Who are you? The exile wasn't expecting anyone to arrive first. It happened so fast that he couldn't even tell who Zen was. But the moment he finished speaking, the flying knife had already pierced his forehead. Bang! Before the exile fell to the ground, Zen had pulled out his long sword and held it forward. The other 3 exiles reacted fast. But with Zen using the bloodline theurgy, they had no chance of defeating him even during a head-on battle. And Zen was attacking them in a rather unique manner. They had no means to resist the attacks. Every single one of them could hardly manage to resist. In the end, they were all killed under Zen's hands. Meanwhile, on the other side, Emily had ordered the group to kill the whites. Because everyone grew more and more proficient in dealing with the whites, the latter no longer posed as a great threat. About 5 minutes later, the last white was slain by Timotheus, Saber. Timotheus, Emily, and the others observed the elevated platforms from a distance. Zen's figure appeared at the very back of the platforms. He gestured to the others with his thumb and smiled easily before disappearing into the darkness. This guy. The scene left Timotheus dumbfounded. Originally, he didn't think that bringing Zen into this world would make such a difference. The rest of the exiles were stunned speechless, it was such a strange thing. So many of them had died under Zen, a mere true god. But Emily chuckled and called out, "Everyone, move on." After another 10 miles, the whites stood in their way once again. From the shadows, Zen emerged and merely killed the lurking men again using thunderous methods. Everyone moved forward smoothly after that. On the way, the exiles from the great races and the wild gods seemed to grow in their admiration. None of them could figure out what particular method Zen had used to easily wipe out their opponents. In spite of the mystery, they also found themselves fortunate to have Zen on their team. Otherwise, they didn't know how many of them would perish. And so the group continued moving forward. 3 days later, they finally stepped out of the densely packed high platforms. Before them was a wall that stood over 10 feet high. "We're finally here," Zelda said, taking a step ahead and looking into the distance. Luther's eyes lit up. It was the Warden race's gathering place, Zelda and Luther's hometown. Growing up, Luther had spent much of his time there. After going through disputes, slaughter, and exploration, he had finally returned. His heart was filled with mixed emotions. "There are people on the wall," one of the wild gods shouted. Everyone then looked towards the wall and found several figures emerging one after another. "It's Spark," Emily announced as murderous intent flashed in her beautiful eyes. In the past, powerful exiles like Timotheus and Spark submitted only to her. But this time, as she planned to leave the world, Spark had decided to stir up trouble for the snake goddess race. This time, she was also injured because of this person. If it weren't for the fact that she was in a hurry to leave the world, she might have already led the snake goddess warriors to destroy the Yellow Emperor race. Atop the wall, Spark stood tall and examined the people in the distance indifferently. Now, he was full of doubts. None of Spark's exiles had returned. Indeed, Tyler had been defeated. But what about the others? Did they all fail? The conditions the Warden race had created gave them a great advantage. Just what method did Emily have up her sleeves to kill the warriors so quietly? All of Spark's former confidence was now destroyed. Emily led the group to the bottom of the city wall. The two sides were several thousand feet apart as they stared at each other in heavy silence. "Spark, we meet again," Timotheus announced with a grin. Spark merely threw him an indifferent glance and snorted. "Timotheus, you have no right to open your mouth here." The words greatly displeased Ramsay, Leopold, and the members of the 9 Li race. One could see their brows furrow in anger. Just when Ramsay was ready to retort, Timotheus stopped him with a shrug and mocking smile. "You're merely a trapped beast that has lost control over its limbs. You've got nothing but your mouth to use." Paying no mind to Timotheus, Spark turned to Emily and said, "They want to make a deal with you." And by they, Spark meant the Warden race. Because the group of warriors had arrived smoothly, people figured that it was because of Emily's ability. This struck fear within Spark in the Warden race. With her hands behind her back, Emily smiled faintly and asked, "What kind of deal?" "You can lead the members of the snake goddess race and leave this place," Spark said. To that, the large races, exiles and wild gods widened their eyes in surprise. Though everyone had finally arrived at the core area of this world, they hadn't really directly fought the Warden race just yet. At this point, no one could yet determine the winner. Spark's offer was rather tempting. In the silence, everyone's eyes were fixed on Emily. If she actually agreed to it, what were they going to do? "It's too late. If you said that before I found this world, there might have been a chance. I'm not stupid enough to say, yes, now." Emily smiled smugly. "They want the snake goddess race to leave, they're already afraid." "Afraid? Why?" Spark sneered. "Judging from Zelda's and Luther's strength, the Warden race isn't all that strong." They already had their inklings about the Warden race's strength, but Zelda's and Luther's appearance had confirmed them. Before Spark answered, a figure clad in black popped up from the city wall. A woman's voice resounded, "You are right. The cultivation base of the members of our Warden race is indeed inferior to yours. But don't forget, you're not the other shore realm warrior, you're just as ordinary as the mortal under the influence of the strength-equalizing theurgy. Our warden race has received the master's privilege. We can break through the limit of the strength-equalizing theurgy. The woman in the black robe stepped out of the shadows and revealed herself as a member of the warden race. Everyone's hearts skipped a beat while they were hearing these words. If the warden race was truly capable of breaking through the limits, all the rest would be in deep trouble. Before the strength-equalizing theurgy was activated, they were strong, but after being equalized, their strength faded away. No matter how weak the warden race was, they were still true gods. And a single true god was enough to defeat them all. Don't listen to this trash. It's impossible for them to completely break from the restrictions of the strength-equalizing theurgy, Zelda announced, walking out from the crowd. Chapter 22:35, Abandon. Zelda looked up at the black figure perching on the city wall. Her pretty face remained calm, but the hatred in her eyes was obvious. She and Luther had suffered too much. Luther was young at the time, and she had had to take on most of the difficulties. She had been devastated to lose her parents. She could do nothing but watch her uncle and his family being crushed by the huge millstone. The three brothers who had saved her were shot down by arrows. And the past flashed before her eyes again with the swiftness of a viper. She had her reasons to want revenge, but she had to try to suppress the hatred that filled her heart. She had become excited at having found the right person, Zen, which resulted in her trying every possible means to ask him to help her. Zelda knew that Zen was a person of integrity, or she would have considered offering him everything she had, including her own body. As she waited, fear overcame her. She was afraid that Zen would go back on his word. She hadn't expected everything to go so smoothly. So step by step, she stepped into this space, and finally returned to her hometown. Now it was time for her to exact her revenge. Aunt Sandy, you weren't expecting us to meet again like this, were you? Zelda smiled, thoroughly enjoying herself. The warden race wasn't too big. Even if the free faction and the conservative faction had become enemies, they could still build up a kind of seniority with each other. That was why Zelda addressed the dark figure as Aunt Sandy. But that didn't mean Zelda regarded her as a respected elder. Sandy stared at Zelda for a while before muttering, I wasn't expecting this. I never thought that your free faction would go this far and choose to lure these outsiders in to kill our race. Zelda made to retort, but Luther's voice interrupted her from behind. You think we have gone too far? Luther walked up to Zelda as he spoke to Sandy, I don't know what gave you that idea. I only know that you killed my parents. So we have no choice. We are going to avenge them. Ever since he could remember, he had had no sense of belonging to the warden race. Instead, he harbored bitter hatred towards the race. So whatever he did, he never felt that he had gone too far. Sandy looked at Luther. He was more important than Zelda, since he had the ability to cut off the cursed chains. Just for revenge, you are the chain breaker of the warden race but don't even know your own mission. How do you even know what hatred is? Sandy said, her voice full of pity. Your so-called mission is only the will of the Chaos Ancient God. We, on the other hand, always yearn for freedom. There is no need to argue thus, Zelda said. There were many disputes between the Free faction and the Conservative faction. So it didn't really matter who was to blame right now. You were right, it is unnecessary, Sandy said. But no longer had she agreed than she let out another screeching order. Kill the man called Luther. Spark waved a hand and at his signal, the men on the city wall took out black crossbows, aimed at Luther, and released the arrows. The distance between them wasn't huge, which was why they were employing the crossbows, to ensure that power and precision were at their peaks. Sandy knew how important Luther was to them. So did Emily and the others. They also knew that Spark was cunning and that they had to constantly be on guard against him. Get out of the way. Emily grabbed Luther and pushed him to the ground, falling with him. The clicking sounds grew closer. The sharp arrows fell with multiple clinks behind them. You think only you can shoot? Timotheus sneered. The men behind him braced themselves. Each of them had a black crossbow in their hands. With a collective twang, they let go of their bowstrings. The radiance of more than 20 black arrows turned into black raindrops and shot towards the city wall. The two men beside Spark couldn't escape the attack. They let out strangled screams and fell off the wall. Spark watched in horror as he hid behind the city wall. He had managed to dodge the attack but threw himself to the floor of the parapet. Sandy, however, stood still, letting the arrows rain down on her cloak. No one knew what her cloak was made of. The arrows couldn't penetrate it and began to fall off it. Sandy sneered. What should we do now? Spark asked. Take your people to the outside of the city wall and stop them, Sandy said coldly. My people, I don't have many followers, Spark said with a bitter smile. Many of the exiles who had followed him had died. And 2 more had been killed just now. He now had only 2 exiles of the Yellow Emperor race left with him. How could they stop the hundreds of people that Emily was leading against them? Moreover, under the effect of the strength equalizing theurgy, their strength was almost the same. Even Spark didn't have the confidence to deal with those wild gods. Then go to perdition. You are good for nothings anyway. I had originally wanted you to fight against each other, but it looks like you are completely useless. They are easily torturing you one by one, Sandy said savagely and retreated. Spark stood still, his heart sinking. It was at this moment that he realized that the Warden race had completely used him. He was usually very smart, making it difficult for others to use him like this. But at the moment, he had been eager to leave this world, and had thought of obstructing the 9 race and the Snake Goddess race. That was why he had willingly agreed to work with the Warden race. He hadn't expected to be abandoned so easily. You. As he looked at Sandy's retreating back, his eyes filled with resentment. Spark, what should we do now? Stop them outside, one of the exiles of the Yellow Emperor race asked him. They had followed Spark all the way here, but they had never thought they would find themselves in such a situation. Forget it, let's go. There was a gleam in Spark's eyes. He had led the Yellow Emperor race for so many years, which obviously meant that he was a remarkable man. And now that he had been abandoned, how could he continue to work for the Warden race? So he made a prompt decision and led his 2 clansmen to the other side. But he vowed that he would not let the Warden race go so easily. Chapter 2236, Chasing. Generally speaking, the wall around where the Warden race had gathered was only 10 feet high. It was built as such because their race never thought that they would be invaded. Besides, their city wall was only a form. When Spark and the 2 exiles escaped, a man climbed over the low city wall. Spark recognized the man on the city wall as the 9 race member who had fought David before. Even Tyler had failed to defeat him at that time. The man, who was actually Zen, met Spark's gaze. He smiled a bit then jumped down. Instead of chasing after Spark, however, he went straight to Sandy. Whoosh! A swishing sound came from Sandy in her billowing cloak. Although she couldn't fly, she was extremely light and moved rapidly along the street. On the other side was Zen, who continuously jumped up and down along the high and low houses. He took advantage of the topography and ran much faster than Sandy. Soon enough, Sandy heard footsteps from her right. She looked around confusedly and saw Zen, who wasn't far away from her. I'm sorry, someone wants you to stay, Zen said softly with a smile. Really? She sneered. She didn't know where he came from, but if he was able to catch up with her, then it only meant one thing. He was very powerful. Even then, she didn't panic. The Warden race couldn't completely get rid of the strength equalizing theurgy just like what Zelda had said, but the Chaos Ancient God had bestowed them with something that could help them in this situation. Swish! At that moment, she ran forward and gently tugged at the belt on her waist. The cloak, which was previously wrapped tightly around her, began to split from the top to the bottom. Her long, white hair flowed freely as well. The people of the Warden race always wore that cloak, and rarely took it off in the presence of others. They only removed it when they were engaged in a fight. Sandy's cloak revealed her flexible figure. Her lips moved slightly, then a blue beam of light flashed from her elbows and a unique type of energy began to form. The fluctuation of the energy. Zen muttered. He now looked seriously at Sandy as he moved along with her on the roof. It was known that all the exiles had become mortals, or beings just slightly stronger than mortals under the influence of the strength equalizing theurgy. Despite that, a member of the Warden race could actually unleash an unimaginably great amount of power with an ordinary physical body. But you are just daydreaming, Sandy whispered. With a wave of her hand, the blue energy accumulated some more and soon turned into 2 sharp blades. She held her blades proudly and grinned at Zen. Suddenly, her body twisted. Swish! A blue ring of light flew towards Zen. Hoo! The ring of light moved at an extremely fast speed. In a moment of desperation, Zen turned over and rolled down from the roof. He stretched his arms on the ground to support himself until he could stand steadily. Meanwhile, the house behind him collapsed when the ring of light cut through it. Boom, boom, boom. The ring of light didn't stop. After one broken house, it went straight and destroyed dozens of houses. If it weren't for the strength equalizing theurgy, its power would be nothing. Any of the wild gods could easily destroy their place. Yet, it was astonishing that Sandy could reach such an extent after she just launched a sword strike. Whoosh, whoosh, The wind blew as Sandy gently waved the two sharp blades and sneered at Zen. Although she couldn't kill him right now, she still felt a bit complacent. "Are you still going to chase me? If you leave now, I can give you a chance and spare your life," said she. On the other hand, Zen stopped looking at the damaged houses and turned to her. "I don't need your chance," he answered with a smile. Hearing his words, her face burned red with anger. She waved her sharp blades and rushed towards Zen. Since she had originally intended to kill Zen anyway, she would do it as fast as she could. She just had to finish him before that group of intruders surrounded her, or she would be in great trouble. Buzz! She wielded the blades in the air and they turned into two huge crescents, which chopped at Zen from both sides. Because she attacked him with such a formidable move, he performed the sword step and gently twisted his body to dodge the blades. "Those are very exquisite movements, but how long can you dodge?" Sandy snickered. Just then, the blue light that glowed around her hands shot towards Zen. After that, all her strikes became fiercer and faster. Zen kept a tight grip on his sword with one hand as he dodged the attacks. He maintained a distance of about 4 feet from Sandy all throughout. With his nimble bodily movement skill, he shuttled through Sandy's light blades. Anyone who would watch them would be worried about Zen. After all, even the smallest mistake could get him cut into pieces. However, Zen even seemed to be happy. On the contrary, Sandy became restless after having launched dozens of strikes. The man was more difficult to deal with than she had expected. If Zen's reinforcements arrived, then she would not be able to leave. She couldn't help but hiss at the thought of it. The two blue sharp blades intertwined with each other and she pushed Zen with the blades, forcing him to retreat. However, she suddenly stopped. The corners of her lips twitched slightly. Then the two blades quickly changed their direction and charged towards Zen's shoulders. If she could hit him, then his shoulders would be amputated. At that point, however, he raised his head and smiled at her as he held a long sword across his chest. His smile confused her. In reality, what he actually planned to do was to use an ordinary long sword to block her two sharp blades, which she thought was silly, because her sharp blades could cut his sword and his body into pieces. This young man should know about that well because he had always refused to use his sword to touch her sharp blades. Therefore, why did he resist the attack in such a stupid way this time? They just fought for a short while, and she didn't have time to think about his behavior, which puzzled her. As soon as she cut towards Zen with her two sharp blades, Zen's arm quietly released a little green truth crystal. Then, a green beam of light quickly spread along his arm and covered his long sword. Clang! There was a loud, crashing sound from the collision, but the scene that Sandy had anticipated did not happen. Zen, however, had discovered her flaws while she was confused. Chapter 2237, Seek Death. Phew! Zen's long sword blocked Sandy's two sharp blades. The sword drew back and immediately twisted towards her neck. Fear crept up in Sandy's face. She never expected that Zen could block her attack with a weapon that was made of common iron. It was impossible for such a weapon to dodge her attack just like that. The only thing that could have possibly allowed him to do that was the green light wrapped around it. How could he utilize that kind of power? She wondered. This unknown skill surprised her to a great extent. She knew she wasn't Zen's match. How else was she going to deal with him? The power of Zen's sword that was coming straight for her meant death. Sandy had no other choice but to retreat. In the end, she managed to avoid the sword, but she lost her balance and fell straight on the ground. Just as she struggled to get back on her feet, Zen's long sword was already pointed on her snow-white neck, while the green light around it had disappeared. "Don't move, or I'll cut your neck," Zen said with a sly smile on his face. "Don't ask me how I did it either." Sandy could only glare at Zen, her chest heaving, and her thoughts wavering. She finally understood why Spark was unable to stop those intruders. Under the effect of the strength-equalizing Thurgy, only the Warden race was able to break the restrictions of the Thurgy. Sandy's double blades were grace from the Master. But Zen seemed to have also broken the restrictions of the strength-equalizing Thurgy. She didn't have time to think about how he did it first. If these people could all break through the restrictions, it meant Spark's men weren't their enemies. Even if the Warden race and Spark had planned it for a long time, the people they sent out to attack would not return. From a distance, a bunch of rapid, disorderly footsteps could be heard along with some murmurs of curse words. "Dang it, Spark sure is quick. I wonder if Zen has caught up with that woman. If we can catch her, things would be a lot easier. I'm a little worried about Zen's safety." Beneath the city wall, Zen had had a brief talk with Emily and others. The situation was clear. Spark and the others with him were no longer a threat to them. All they had to face was the Warden race, their real enemy. There was a saying that went, "Know the enemy as you know yourself." At that time, no one had any idea how to deal with their nemesis. Although Zelda knew a little about the Warden race, it just wasn't enough. The Warden race sent Sandy in hopes to convince Emily, along with the entire Snake Goddess race, to surrender. If they caught that woman and forced her to tell them the secrets about the Warden race, they could be at an advantage. So, Timotheus led several people to go after Spark, while Zen took the initiative to chase after Sandy. However, under the cover of several exiles, Spark had escaped successfully. That was why everyone rushed back. They didn't think Zen would actually catch the woman. After all, they knew that the Warden race wasn't so easy to be up against. Surprisingly, just as soon as they crossed the street, they noticed Zen pressing his long sword on the skin of Sandy's neck. Emily raised her eyebrows slightly. She knew she was right. She had long suspected that Zen had some extremely powerful methods that he just never showed. That was the exact reason why Emily trusted Zen to chase the woman by himself. It didn't matter much if Zen wasn't able to catch her. But as expected, Zen had once again delivered. Got her. Ha! One of the exiles couldn't help but laugh. Seeing this scene, the others began to ponder about the events that had occurred along the way. They always thought of Zen as someone outrageous. After all, it was Zen who helped all the people get through in the end. They all felt lucky and grateful that they had Zen at that moment. If it wasn't for him, Emily might also have the ability to bring them here, but more people would have died. Sandy leaned on the ground. Upon seeing Zelda among the crowd with a smile on her face, she whispered, "For the sake of my master. You bugs. You keep dreaming to leave this world." A determined look replaced the anger on her face. Immediately, she hit herself against Zen's long sword. Zen was quick to act. With a slight shake of his sword, only the blunt side of it hit Sandy's skin, which left a straight blood mark on her neck. But if Zen didn't kill her, she had ways to force him to do so. Since she was already in between life and death, she didn't have any more qualms. Some sort of blue textures had appeared on her arms, and the two sharp blades had condensed again. She brandished her weapons and pulled Zen into an embrace. "If you don't kill me, then let's die together." Strange lights flashed in her eyes. The two sharp blades were too close to Zen. He had no other choice. He frowned, then reluctantly moved forward with his sword. The bright silver sword penetrated her chest. Despite so, Sandy managed to push her two sharp blades forward. Before they could even touch his skin, Zen had already nailed her to the ground. The two sharp blades gleamed with blue light for the last time before they broke into pieces. The people who were able to see everything froze in their tracks. They never expected such a thing to happen. The smiles on their faces faded away. Splash! Zen pulled out the sword from her swelling chest, and blood immediately gushed out. His face was filled with regret. "I didn't expect her to be so tenacious," said Emily, pursing her thin lips. "She wanted to die. I had no choice," Zen replied, with a hint of helplessness in his voice. "You did well," Emily reassured. An exile from the fire-melting race nodded in agreement. "Yes. Now, we have finally killed a member of the Warden race." The way this group of exiles talked to Zen changed. Before, they were condescending towards him, but at that moment, they treated him as an equal. Emily bent down to study the textures that had appeared on Sandy's arms. "Zelda, are these razor blades bestowed upon her by the Chaos Ancient God?" Stepping forward, Zelda was a little shocked by what she had seen. After all, the woman who had died right before her very eyes was a member of the Warden race, and they shared the same bloodline. However, when she remembered the time when her family was killed, her heart grew cold again. "Yes," she replied. "After the strength equalizing theurgy has been activated, the master of our race will grant us grace to help us get rid of the limitations of such theurgy. The grace for everyone is the ability to condense a pair of sharp blades?" Zen asked, still fixated on Sandy's corpse. If that was the case, then things would become easier. Those blades were sharp indeed, but the Warden race weren't as difficult to deal with as they thought they would be. "No, it isn't," Zelda shook her head. She knew why Zen was asking such a question. Everyone's grace is different. Some are strong, and some are weak. Chapter 2238, The Tomb Keeper. Emily, Timotheus, and the others frowned when they heard the news. It was very troublesome for all of them, but it was relatively better than they initially expected. At the very least, the Warden race was also restricted by the strength equalizing theurgy. They wouldn't be able to go beyond their limits without the grace of the Chaos Ancient God. If the strength equalizing theurgy didn't work on the Warden race, Then all of them might end up being slaughtered by the race without any room to fight back. Since they have the grace of the Chaos Ancient God, does that mean you and Luther can obtain it as well? Zen asked out of curiosity. Zelda nodded. Hypothetically yes, but the place where we can obtain the grace isn't here. We have to go to the foot of the Prey Tablet, but it's difficult to get close to it because it is in the deepest part of our base. Either way, we would still have to give it a shot, Zen said with a smile. Zelda nodded. We're on the way there. If we get the chance to approach the Prey Tablet, I'll pray to the Chaos Ancient God for his grace. At the core of their base, a bunch of life lamps emitted steady lights around the huge disc. Many powerful practitioners preferred not to make the life lamps because the life lamps had the tendency to expose some flaws. However, under the effect of the strength equalizing theurgy, these flaws didn't exist anymore. As a result, the Warden race had already prepared their life lamps and arranged them accordingly around the disc. Boom! One of the life lamps suddenly made a faint sound. The bean-sized flame in the middle of the lamp dimmed as it shook a few times before finally going out. Did Sandy's life lamp just go out? Who could have possibly killed her? She was always very cautious. For some reason, she was unable to escape safely. Those people. Most of the members of the Warden race were gathered on the open space on the opposite side. At the front of the open space were about 7 or 8 people sitting cross-legged on the stairs. At the top of the stairs was a member of the Warden race. He was the old man who rotated the round disc to activate the strength equalizing theurgy. Staring at the fading life lamp, the old man couldn't help but feel a bit sad. As he looked at the clansmen who were discussing, the old man said, "The opponents are quite stronger than we imagined." Stronger. No matter how strong they really are, they are still a group of mortals. How can they be so frightening? A man in a black robe stood up from the crowd. Although he was covered in a black robe, he was obviously a tall and strong man just by looking at his body and listening to his voice. What are you afraid of? Send us to fight. We are not afraid of the snake goddess race and we will fight them to the death if we have to, a second man in a black robe added. The old man still hesitated. He didn't think that the people being led by Spark could be so weak. After thinking for a while, he attributed the matter to Emily and sent Sandy. He was planning to eliminate the snake goddess race and wipe out the exiles from the other big races. However, it seemed that this plan was already bound to fail. Thanks to the grace of our master, we can kill those people with ease as if we are merely killing chickens and dogs. A third man in a black robe stood up. Many clansmen began to shout at the same time. After a short while, the old man finally made up his mind. You are right, we shouldn't fear them at all. The old man slowly stood up. Now that they have entered our city, we have no other choice. All of us have been blessed by the grace of our master and we owe it all to him. We cannot fail him. We must win this battle no matter what. The old man's words were received by the crowd with a huge round of applause. Arvin. Yes, sir. Bonnie. Here, sir. Bergen. At your service, sir. Quote quote. The old man made arrangements as planned. Almost half of the people left immediately. The old man then said to the black-robed man with purple hair who was standing on the stairs, "Come with me. We shall go to see the tombkeeper." When he heard those words, the black-robed man with purple hair trembled slightly and asked, "Why do we need to see him?" "Just in case," the old man replied. The black-robed man with purple hair seemed very reluctant as he firmly said, "We won't fail in this battle." "What will happen if we do?" the old man asked. The black-robed man with purple hair couldn't say anything so he simply nodded instead. The old man then came down from the steps and walked in another direction with the black-robed man with purple hair. After passing through an empty area, they were greeted by a low mountain. At the back of the mountain were some tombstones. The Warden race couldn't discover the secrets to an eternal life. In other words, their master refused to give them the gift of eternal life. Thousands of clansmen had been buried under those tombstones. Some of the tombstones were so old that the words written on them could no longer be read. The old man was far from being young as well. After 4 loops of reincarnation, which could be 4,000 years later, he would also take his eternal slumber in this place. Every time he passed by the cemetery, the old man couldn't help but take deep breaths and think about what was ahead of him. After passing the tombstones, they finally reached the foot of the mountain behind. At the foot of the mountain was a tombstone that was 100 feet high. The tombstone was empty. No one knew exactly why it was there, nor did they know who was buried under it. A dirty young man was lying in front of the tombstone. The young man had been living underneath the tombstone for countless years, yet his image had never changed. His personality was rather odd and he liked talking nonsense. He also rarely communicated with the Warden race. In the past, the people of the warden race found trouble with the young man. They once gathered over 100 members to surround him. But the power of the young man made them realize that they could not provoke him no matter how hard they tried. He was way stronger than any exile in this world. Fortunately for them, he was not bloodthirsty at all. He only taught them a valuable lesson during the conflict and then immediately let them go. Since then, no one from the warden race ever dared to provoke him again. The warden race had a lot of speculations about the person's real identity, but they never reached a clear conclusion. Actually, he wasn't really a tomb keeper, but since he had been staying in front of the tombstone for so long, the warden race decided to call him that way. In the old man's mind, there must be a reason why their master brought the man there. Now that the warden race had reached its most critical moment, the old man hoped that he would be willing to give them the support they needed. The old man and the black-robed man with purple hair walked towards the foot of the tombstone, but they didn't see the young man right away. As the two of them scratched their heads in confusion, they saw the young man sitting on top of the tombstone. He was looking down at them as he chuckled and said, "You have used the strength equalizing theurgy of the old monster. It seems that you are in a lot of trouble." Chapter 2239, You Can't Pass. The old man raised his head and clasped his hands together as he replied with sincerity, "You're right. Our race is indeed facing a crucial enemy invasion." The young man that stood on top of the tombstone chuckled. "By enemies, you mean the exiles in this world, right?" "Yes," the old man nodded. "You came to ask for my help. Is that right?" the young man asked again. The old man sighed to himself and could only nod in response. That young man might have looked crazy, but his strength sure was immeasurably compelling. Most importantly, he didn't get imprisoned in that world like the exiles. Instead, he just showed up in the space where the warden race resided. The old man had no clue why his master arranged such an encounter. The young man had been their neighbor for countless years. Maybe he wanted to help them for that reason. The old monster's strength equalizing theurgy is really powerful. Even I am affected by it, so I am no different than any ordinary warrior now. My assistance might not make any difference, the young man smiled, shaking his head. Upon hearing his words, a complicated expression crept up on the old man's face. All of a sudden, he bent his legs and knelt before the young man. "I ask you to please help our race," the old man said. The man with purple hair immediately grew anxious when he saw their leader kneel. "Sir," he called out. Since the man had already mentioned about his cultivation base being weakened due to the strength equalizing theurgy, he wondered why their leader still had to beg him like that. However, the old man's gesture didn't change the expression on the young man's face. He then jumped off the tombstone and walked straight to the old man as he clicked his tongue in annoyance. "I made a bet with Herbert in the past, which is why I've been imprisoned in this world for trillions of years. Up to this day, I still couldn't figure it out." Hearing his words, both the old man and the man with purple hair were taken aback. They were surprised to know that he was also a prisoner of that world. In that case, he was an enemy of the warden race. If he were to offer his help, it only meant that he was doing it for the selfish reason of escaping. After making such judgment, the old man and the man with purple hair grew in fear. The tomb keeper noticed the change in their expressions. He turned to them and said with a faint smile, "I've lived next to you for a long time. I've seen things. I can say that your conservative faction is indeed loyal and responsible to your duties. Unfortunately, you are unaware that Herbert doesn't care so much about this place." "What are you trying to say?" The old man slowly stood up and asked with great concern. That got involved with the disputes among the conservative and the free factions. When the free faction wanted to leave that world in the past, they didn't fight against the conservative faction. Instead, they had an intense debate that lasted for many years. The most principal opinion of the free faction was that their master had given up on them and their world, making their race expendable. As for the conservative faction, they insisted that their master would return to their world sooner or later and that they should stick to their task. The old man had insisted on carrying out his task until now. "There isn't just one prison," the tomb keeper shrugged his shoulders. "Herbert built 60 to 70 of these at the bottom of the chaos, and he repeated the process but failed each time. This one you've been guarding is just one of his failures. Do you understand?" "A failure? Why is it a failure? No one has ever escaped from here since the very beginning," the old man demanded in a serious but quivering voice. He had spent his whole life guarding this place, only to be told that it was just a failure. That was unacceptable, not to mention that the warden race had spent countless years in that place. Who could accept such a harsh truth? The tomb keeper maintained his lazy smile. Looking at the old man's distressed face, he couldn't help but sigh. The Chaos Ancient Gods have already become significant figures of the entire chaos, he said. Do you really think Herbert was bored enough to arrange such a prison and capture some insignificant people? Do the exiles have such values? Even powerful people like Emily and Timotheus didn't have the qualification to be taken seriously by the Chaos Ancient Gods. Compared to the Chaos Ancient Gods, the exiles were nothing. That was why the young man's words rendered the old man speechless. He knew he was right. If their Supreme Master was one of the most powerful beings in the chaos, then why did he have to imprison the exiles in that place? For the warden race to question their master's intention was disrespectful, so they never wondered about such matters in the past. Our master, why did he create this world? Why did he create us? The old man struggled to ask. The Free Faction had raised such a question countless times in the past. He understood their standpoint at that very moment. With a faint smile on his face, the Tomb Keeper said, "You don't need to know that anymore. Your master has given up on you, so you don't have to be too hard on yourself anymore. If the exiles want to leave, you can let them go. It's not bad for things to end this way." Nonsense, the man with purple hair finally shouted after holding back for a while. The old man added, "Guarding this prison is the responsibility of our race. That is the reason why we were created. Even if our master turned his back on us, we won't give up. If you don't want to help us, then we shall take our leave." The old man bowed in respect to the Tomb Keeper, then turned around to depart. The man with purple hair followed close behind. In his opinion, their leader made an unnecessary move by asking for the young man's help. There was no reason for them to ask assistance from a freak like him. As they began to walk away from the tomb, the young man said, "Although your determination bores me, I appreciate persistent people like you." As he spoke, he stretched himself, which made cracking noises. "I've stayed here for too long. This tablet didn't do me any good. I think I'd like to get some good exercise now." His statement stopped the old man in his tracks. He turned back around and looked straight at the Tomb Keeper. His dim eyes lit up with excitement. "Are you going to help us?" On the other side, however, Emily, Zen, and others also stopped their steps. A man in a black robe stood before them. Blue butterflies danced around him. Although those butterflies were extremely beautiful, they contained deadly power. "You can't pass," the man in the black robe said flatly. More black-robed men began to appear on the roofs on both sides of the street. Some of the wild gods and exiles could not help but take several steps back. That was the first time that they had to fight against the warden race, and they were very frightened. Chapter 2240, Chaotic Battle. Zelda and Luther came back to the center of the group, protected by the others encircling them. After all, they were the two most important people here. They needed the extra protection, for the warden race might take them as their first targets. Zen, who was walking in the front of the group, narrowed his eyes and asked, "What if we're determined to pass through?" The man wearing a black robe raised his hand gently, and all the butterflies surrounding him began to flutter violently, forming a pair of wings and floating behind the man. "The ball is still in your court. This is your last chance. Leave Luther and Zelda behind or you will all die." "There's no way." Zelda's voice was heard ringing out from the back. The others didn't utter a single word. They knew that by coming this far, retreating wasn't an option. "Oh, really?" The man in the black robe sneered and waved his hand, with more intensity this time. He slowly removed the black robe attached to his body and revealed his looks. Beneath the robe was a strong young man with a shockingly obvious scar on his nose. As the young man removed his cloak, the other men on the roofs, equally in black robes, took theirs off too. For the warden race, this was their battle signal. "Seeing as you aren't seizing your final chance, you'll just have to die along with these two miserable people." Swish. As soon as he finished speaking, the butterflies behind the young man fluttered in disorder, rushing directly at the group in a giant wave. "You're dealing with the enemies on both sides." At that, Zen took the group's lead in charging the group forward. These men in black robes all had blue energy, which was gifted to them by the Chaos Ancient God. According to what Zelda had said, everyone would receive different benefits from the Chaos Ancient God. Now, it seemed that the dense clutter of butterflies in front of them were their greatest threat. Moreover, it was impossible for them to get too close, and therefore, Zen took it upon himself to make the first move. "Shoot," Emily ordered as she focused her attention. The exiles pointed their bows and arrows at the warriors standing on both sides of the path. In seconds, they were ready to shoot them. Swish, swish, swish. As the arrows shot out one after the next, the warden race's warriors all lowered their bodies at once. With a series of deafening thuds, the arrows hit the roof tiles viciously. There's no way we're retreating. If we don't fight, we'll die. Come on, let's go. Emily said in a clear, confident voice. Of course, she knew that most of the wild gods and even a few of the exiles were feeling scared. It was up to her to motivate them. The members of the Warden race fought desperately, while Emily's group had the only goal of escaping this world as soon as they could. This contradiction, however, simply couldn't be reconciled. In the current moment, no one had any other choice but to give the battle everything they had and go all out. All Emily could truly do was to encourage them to fight, even if this meant risking their lives. As she called out to the group she led, Emily lifted the annular saber, stepped gently on the ground with her tiptoe, and made a leap onto a roof with an extremely beautiful posture. Emily had been shot in the collarbone before, but her injury wasn't serious. As she faced the Warden race straight on, she dared not to take them carelessly. She could only lead the other warriors to fight together alongside her. Master Emily is right, there is no way to retreat now. We should follow her. A wild god from the snake goddess race said loudly, following Emily onto the roof. The moment the wild god had reached the top, a man in a black robe sneered and gently clasped his hands together. The blue light appeared immediately, and a huge axe came into view out of nowhere. The weapon slashed down toward her head. Die! The cloaked man yelled. Puff! The axe formed by the blue energy was nearly invincible. One thing for certain, the weapon was absolutely terrifying. Besides, now the wild god was nothing more than an ordinary person. Without any time to react, she was sliced in half, blood splattering all over the ground. Claudia. As they watched the scene from a distance, the members of the snake goddess race were stunned silent. When they realized what had happened, they were immediately overwhelmed with grief. Kill them, a warrior hurled. Let's fight with them, another called out. The warriors of the snake goddess race quickly became sad and indignant. As for the others, although they had earlier shown their timidity, after seeing Claudia's miserable state, they finally understood what no going back actually meant. The only way to survive this battle now was to risk their own lives and fight for the good of their entire race. They were in a dangerous situation. They felt as though they were standing on a single log bridge and below them was an infinite abyss. Crossing over the abyss was only possible once their enemies had been killed. Kill! Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. More people precipitated to the rooftops, climbing fiercely up both sides. The sound of arrows shooting and whizzing through the air could be heard, and rays of blue light began shining from the roofs. Swish, swish, swish. Within seconds, countless butterflies flew upward, like flowers sprouting high into the skies. A strapping man from the Warden race raised his hands and they suddenly turned into sharp claws. He pointed them directly at Zen. At that very moment, all the butterflies transformed into a huge cage and shot toward Zen at once. Their only objective was to envelop him. Zen was running at an extremely fast speed. Just as the cage was about to trap him, he suddenly changed directions with a few very awkward steps. His entire body nearly leaned straight into the ground. Using his waist strength, he only staggered a little before steadying himself. As he did so, Zen succeeded in completely avoiding the cage. Swish! The long sword shook slightly in Zen's hand before he stabbed it toward the strapping man before him. The man was taken aback with surprise. No one would have guessed that Zen was so flexible. That said, the man had no intentions of retreating before Zen. The butterflies that had turned into a cage quickly transformed once again, but this time, into a curtain in order to block the man from the front all while moving toward Zen. Facing the curtain made of the butterflies, Zen felt that he suddenly had no choice but to retreat. He moved a few steps horizontally, trying to find a gap in order to get closer to the butterflies. However, the butterflies were incredibly nimble. When Zen had finally found a little space and tried to attack, the butterflies moved and protected the man instead. Zen tried to attack 8 times in a row and circled around the strapping man 3 times. Several times, when his long sword was only a foot away from the strapping man, the butterflies surged over at the last second. Alas, Zen decided he had no choice but to give up. Is that your only skill? The strapping man grinned coldly. At that, he flicked his fingers and the blue butterflies flew around him in disorder. They began to spread in all directions. If only the butterflies could maintain a certain rule or pattern. At least then Zen could easily avoid them. Now that all the butterflies were moving in an irregular way though, it was much too difficult for Zen to dodge. He could only move cautiously among them. He had to be very carefully when doing so because the winged insects were in fact very dangerous. It was a pity that Zen couldn't use the 8 smoky melodies in his current situation. If he could use it, then these butterflies wouldn't be capable of touching him at all, not even if he closed his eyes. Puff. Zen kept moving backward, all while the strapping man manipulated the butterflies to continue approaching him. Constantly dodging, Zen suddenly felt a sharp pain run up his right leg. A blue butterfly had skimmed across his outer leg, leaving a mark as thick as a thumb. Due to his injury, Zen began to move more slowly, and countless butterflies gathered around him. Go to perdition, the strapping man shouted at Zen in a ferocious voice. From Zen's point of view, he could only expect to be bitten and seriously injured by these raging butterflies within the next 3 seconds.